The sun, tireless and eternal, rose every day on the vast sand of Egypt, illuminating a landscape that seemed to have been molded by ancient gods. The desert breeze whispered stories of remote times, while the Nile, majestic and vital, cut the landscape as an artery that gave life to everything that played. This river was not just water, it was sustenance, power, and spirit. It was the beginning of everything. Hundreds of generations lived and died along their banks, venerating it as a divine being. The peasants looked at the sky, looking forward to the annual flood, knowing that with those dark waters the promises of fertile fields and abundant crops arrived. But there was something else, something that went beyond food or commerce. There was a deep, almost inexplicable connection between the Nile and the souls of those around him. Egypt was not just a place on the map, it was a throbbing heart that marked the rhythm of time. Imagine it! It was an enigma where the pharaohs, considered descendants of the gods, built monuments that would challenge death itself. Each stone placed in a pyramid, each hieroglyph carved on a wall, was a cry to infinity: we are here, and we will continue to be. The geography of Egypt was his destiny. The imposing desert sands protected their lands as if they were a natural shield, while the fertile valley of the Nile offered everything necessary for life. But this land was not delivered effortlessly. We had to work, pray and respect the gods to guarantee continuity. Each flood not only brought water but also uncertainty. Would it be enough? Or maybe too much, sweeping everything? That balance, between abundance and disaster, became the axis of Egyptian existence. However, beyond everyday concerns, there was something in the air of Egypt that fed the imagination. Perhaps it was the way the stars seemed to hang closer to the ground, as if they observed with curiosity the life that was developed under them. Or perhaps it was the silence of the desert, interrupted only by the echo of the wind that, when touching the dunes, created a sound similar to the whisper of old legends. Egypt always had that strange ability to awaken a sense of astonishment. Even today, thousands of years later, those who contemplate the ruins feel that chill, that feeling that they are looking at something much bigger than they themselves. The monuments remain as sleeping giants, waiting for someone to try to understand their purpose. The sands keep secrets that seem to resist being counted, but there is also something deeply human in those places. Each brick, each registration is a proof that men and women lived here with dreams, fears, and hopes. The Nile flowed incessant, reflecting the colors of the sky, sometimes quiet, sometimes furious. But I never ceased to be a mirror of the Egyptian soul, resistant, mysterious, and full of life. However, the river not only connected towns and cities, he connected people with their deepest beliefs. It was a bridge between the earthly and the divine. Every drop that touched the skin of a peasant seemed to have the blessing of the gods, a promise that life would continue. It was impossible to walk on its banks without feeling almost instinctive reverence. Every corner of Egypt told a story. From noisy markets to silent temples, everything was impregnated with a greater purpose. Life was not seen as an accident, but as part of a great divine plan. And in the center of that plan was Egypt, the place where the earth and the sky were. And even, while the sun was put behind the hills, painting the horizon of gold and red tones, something was clear: Egypt was a place that would never give up before oblivion. Their stories would continue to beat in the stones, in the river, and in the stars that once illuminated the nights of those who created this immortal civilization. And just as the Nile never stops flowing, nor do the stories of this land, waiting for the right time to be heard again. Would you like to continue with the following title, or there is something specific that you want to adjust or add in this text? The desert wind, warm and eternal, carried the aroma of the freshly carved land and the sound of the first steps of a nascent civilization. Long before the pharaohs raised their great monuments, long before the Nile was revered as a god, on their banks the dreams of a people who still did not know that it was destined for immortality began to germinate. It was a time when humanity was just beginning to understand their power. The pre-dynastic period marked that thin line between simple survival and the search for something more big, something that could transcend generations. Between the sands and thickets of the Nile Valley, small communities began to group, driven by the need to share resources, protect themselves from dangers, and find meaning in the union. Hierakonpolis and Nikkada, names that now resonate with history, were then vibrant points of activity. In Hierakonpolis, the murmur of trade filled the air. The inhabitants exchanged finely decorated ceramics and stone tools, each piece a testimony of their ingenuity and creativity. But there was more than commerce in his hands. Each object seemed to speak of a restless spirit, of a desire to express what their words could not yet. The first ceramics, with their animal figures and abstract symbols, seemed to tell stories that the men and women of that time could not forget. Hunting stories, stations, and a river that gave life, but could also remove it. There was an almost sacred intention in those decorations, a way of connecting with forces that still did not understand, but deeply felt. Meanwhile, in Nakada, the ground was being shaped with the precision of those who were learning to tame it. Here, the first fields of cultivation flourished, and with them, the promise of stability. The seeds not only germinated on earth, they germinated in the minds of those who began to imagine a future beyond hunger and uncertainty. It was a fragile moment, but full of possibilities. The primitive tombs of Nakada, dug on earth, also told a silent story. The bodies, carefully wrapped in mats, often accompanied by personal objects, were a sign that death was not seen as the end, but as a continuation of something else. There was a deep respect for those who had lived before, as if each generation carried the responsibility of honoring those who came before. But not everything was peace. These first communities faced constant challenges. The unpredictable climate, the predators and, perhaps the most dangerous, the conflicts between groups that fought for limited resources. However, from these tensions a major force arose. The need to collaborate, to create social structures that avoid chaos, pushed these first Egyptians to develop leadership systems, shared rituals, and a collective identity. The Nile, always present, acted as a conductive thread among these first cities. Its waters led not only life, but also stories and traditions. The primitive boats, made of papyrus, crossed the river carrying products, but also ideas. It was here, in this constant exchange, where the foundations of what would later be one of the most complex and fascinating civilizations in the world began to take shape. The stone tools evolved, the crops diversified, and the settlements expanded. But the most important thing was what could not be seen with the naked eye. A seed of greatness began to take root in the minds of this town. They were no longer satisfied with surviving, they wanted to prosper, they wanted to build something that could resist the passage of time. Each painted ceramics, each tomb carefully prepared, each alliance forged between communities was a step toward something that they still could not name but that intuited deeply. There was a mixture of uncertainty and hope in the air of these first settlements. The stars on Hierakonpolis shone with the same intensity as thousands of years later would illuminate the Giza pyramids. The river that ran next to Nakada carried not only water, but also the promise of a future that, although uncertain, was full of possibilities. And while the sun hid behind the dunes, the inhabitants of these first cities closed their eyes, dreaming of what would come later. The story remembers Nama as the man who, with a single crown, united two worlds that lived for centuries separately. Alto Egypt and Bajo Egypt, like two brothers divided by pride, finally found a common destination under their reign. But behind this act of unification there was blood, sweat, and the vision of a leader who understood that true power was not to divide, but to join. Nama was not just a king, it was a strategist, a warrior and, according to the stories, almost a divine figure. His name echoed as an echo in the valleys and deserts. It was not easy to govern such a vast land, where the Nile spread like a spine, connecting but also separating. The lands of the north, rich in fertile deltas and papyrus reeds, looked suspiciously at the south, where the mountains and the desert mold a hardened town. Two different worlds, two ways of life, two ways of thinking. The conflict between these territories had been long, full of small battles and great tensions. But Nama, instead of simply conquering, understood that true victory was to create something that both territories could claim as their own. The famous Nama palette, with its engravings loaded with symbolism, is a testimony of this crucial moment. In it, it shows it by carrying the white crown of the Alto Egypt and the red crown of Base Egypt, as if declared to the world, these lands are no longer rival, they are now a single nation. But unification was not just politics, it was a deep change that marked the beginning of a new era. Nama established Memphis, a city that would rise like the heart of this new unified Egypt, right on the symbolic border between the north and the south. There, the Nile flowed quietly, as if even the river knew that something historical was happening. Memphis's walls rose not only as a fortress, but as a symbol of stability and a new order that promised to overcome the conflicts of the past. The creation of the two lands did not mean borders. It was also to unite ideas, traditions, and gods. In the north, the delta venerated Wadjet, the goddess Charges, while in the south, the goddess Buatre-Nekbet reigned over the heavens. With Nama, both found a place in the same crown, thus joining the beliefs of a people that until then had lived even divided into their spirituality. The gods did not fight, they were complemented, just as the lands would now. The beginning of the dynastic system was another of Nama's legacies. Before him, leaders could be seen as tribal chiefs or local kings. But Nama changed that. With him, Pharaoh ceased to be just an earthly ruler and became a mediator between the human and the divine. It was the incarnation of Horus, the halcyon god, the protector of order and justice. Under his command, the concept of Maat, that delicate balance between chaos and harmony, became the cornerstone of the Egyptian government. But unifying Egypt was not the end, it was the beginning. Nama knew that building something lasting required more than military force. Therefore, he promoted the creation of administrative systems, established a tax structure, and encouraged the development of infrastructure that would further connect to the two lands. The scribes, those guardians of knowledge, began to register life under their reign, marking the beginning of an era in which the words carved in stone would be as powerful as the swords. In each temple that rose and in each decree that was promulgated, there was a clear intention to consolidate what had been achieved with so much effort. But could this balance last? That question, although without an answer in his time, would be like an echo in the dynasties that would follow. While Nama looked at the waters of the Nile since his palace, he might think about what he had achieved. Not only had it unified land, he had planted the seed of a civilization that would challenge the time itself. But the river continued flowing, taking with them the whispers of the ancients and the promise of what was to come. The Nile was much more than a river. It was the soul of Egypt, a gift from the gods that beat with a constant and vital rhythm. His current not only moved water, he moved lives, hopes, and the very existence of a civilization that learned to dance to the beat of his floods. Where the desert seemed to devour everything, the Nile drew a green line, fertile and full of promises. His presence was not only geographical, it was spiritual, almost palpable, as if its waters whisper the secrets of the universe whom they lived near their banks. Every year, the river offered its most precious gift, floods. It was a powerful, almost scary show. The waters grew with a relentless force, covering the fields, the roads, and sometimes the villages. But the Egyptians did not fear this phenomenon, they revered him. They knew that, when the waters went back, they would leave behind a dark and fertile silt, loaded with life. It was an eternal cycle, a reminder that death and rebirth were inseparable parts of existence. The peasants worked tirelessly, taking advantage of the generosity of the river. His tan hands sowed wheat, barley, and linen, while looking at the sky, thanking Hapi, the god of floods, for his goodness. The sweat that ran on its fronts was mixed with the earth, and together they created an abundance that would support their families, but to all of Egypt. But there was a deeper relationship between man and the river. Cultivating was not just a physical act, it was almost a ritual, a silent dialogue with the Nile, which responded with fruits and grains. The river was also an economic artery. Boats loaded with goods flowed through its waters, ceramics, papyri, wheat and gold. The ships, driven by row and candles, connected cities and villages, carrying not only materials, but also ideas, songs, and beliefs. From the delta in the north to the cataracts in the south, the Nile joined a country that, without it, would be just a fragmented desert. But the Nile was not just a supplier, it was also a god. Its religious importance was absolute. In the temples, the priests offered prayers and sacrifices to ensure that the waters arrived in the fair quantity. Not too little, to avoid famine, or too much, to prevent destruction. The life of each Egyptian, from the most humble peasant to the pharaoh, was intrinsically linked to the mood of the river. And when the Nile behaved unexpectedly, prayers became more intense, almost desperate, as if they tried to appease a wounded deity. The river cycle not only defined the economy, but also the calendar. the Egyptians divided the year into 3 stations: Akhet, the flood; Peret, growth; and Shimu, the harvest. Each station was a piece of the puzzle of life, a reminder that time flowed, just like the river, in an endless circle. Even the idea of life after death was inspired by this cycle. Just as the Nile waters returned every year, the Egyptians believed that their souls would also be reborn in the hereafter. In the calm nights, when the sun hid behind the hills and stars they appeared in the sky, the waters of the Nile reflected the points of light as if they were a mirror of the universe. At that time, the Egyptians sat in silence, listening to the murmur of the river. Some said that, if one paid attention, he could hear the voices of the ancestors mixed with the sound of water. The Nile was not just a place, it was a link between the living and the dead, between the earthly and the divine. It was the proof that life could flourish even in the most inhospitable places, that perseverance and human ingenuity could transform the impossible in reality. He was the guardian and the witness of a civilization that, thanks to him, would reach immortality. The Egyptian world was woven with invisible threads that connected every aspect of life with something much bigger, something eternal. In the heart of his worldview was Maat, a concept that not only defined order but gave meaning to existence itself. Maat was not simply an abstract idea, it was a living force, a goddess, a presence that regulated the balance between all things, light and darkness, good and evil, life and death. Maat was the invisible axis held by the universe. The Egyptians saw the world as a delicate balance, constantly threatened by chaos. This chaos, known as Isfet, was not just disorder, it was the abyss, the denial of everything good, the constant threat that the world could crumble at any time. For them, living was maintaining that balance, a daily resistance act against the forces that sought to destroy it. The duality was an essential part of this fight. Egypt itself was an land of opposites, the High Egypt, with its rocky hills and its connection with the desert, and the Base Egypt, with its fertile deltaic plains. Although different, both were part of a whole that should be preserved. The unification of these lands, symbolized by the double crown of the pharaoh, was more than a political act, it was the representation of how opposite forces could coexist in harmony. The High and Base Egypt were like day and night, different, but interdependent, each necessary for the other to have meaning. The pharaoh was not only an earthly ruler, but the guardian of Maat. His responsibility was to maintain balance in all things, to guarantee justice, prosperity and order, both on earth and in the cosmos. Each decree that issued, every temple he built, was an act of devotion to this sacred idea. And when the pharaoh failed, when chaos threatened to gain ground, in the form of famines, rebellious rebellions or floods, the Egyptians perceived it as a crack in the tissue of the universe. Duality was also reflected in its myths. Osiris and Set, confronted brothers, embodied the eternal cycle of life and death, of order and chaos. Osiris, killed and dismembered by Set, not only represented death, but also the possibility of reborn, to restore Maat even in the most desperate circumstances. Horus, the son of Osiris, was the symbol of the victory of order over chaos, but also of the reconciliation between opposites, because even in revenge against Set, Horus had to find balance. Maat was not only in temples and myths, I was in every corner of everyday life. It was seen in the way in which the peasants distributed the Nile water fairly, in the market transactions, in the words of the scribes. Tell the truth, act with justice, respect the gods and others, all this was to live according to Maat. Even after death, each person's soul would be judged before the balance of Maat, where his heart would weigh against the sacred pen. If the heart was light, the soul continued on its way to eternity, if he was heavy, he was devoured by Amit, the monster of the underworld. However, Maat was not static. It was a dynamic balance, always in motion, always challenged. The Egyptians understood that life was not perfect, that chaos was always on the prowl. But they also believed that, with effort, faith and dedication, they could maintain balance. Each dawning was proof of this, a reminder that Ra, the sun god, had defeated the chaos of the night and had brought the light once more. Thus, the Egyptian worldview was not just a way of explaining the world, it was a guide to live in him. Each act, however small, had a purpose in the great scheme of things. And while the Nile flowed and the stars turned in the sky, the Egyptians continued to believe that while Maat existed, his world would also do. The sky of Egypt, clear and eternal, observed the rise of pyramids with a mixture of solemnity and admiration. There, between the golden sands and under the scorching sun, the most monumental structures ever imagined by humanity were built. Giza's pyramids were not simple tombs, they were doors towards eternity, a challenge to time and a testimony of an era in which the pharaohs not only ruled, but walked among men as gods. Khufu, the pharaoh who commissioned the Great Pyramid, understood its role in an almost cosmic sense. He was not a common man, he was the mediator between heaven and earth, the representative of the gods in the earthly world. His destiny did not end death, on the contrary, it truly began to cross that threshold. The pyramid, with its perfect geometry and its precise orientation towards the stars, was not only its tomb, but a vehicle for its ascension to the divine kingdom. The construction of these colossal structures was a feat that mixed engineering, faith, and unparalleled human work. Thousands of men, peasants during the flood season, became builders under the mandate of their pharaoh. They were not slaves, as has often been believed, they were workers who saw their work as a sacred duty. Each stone block, each rudimentary tool, each drop of sweat was an offering to its king and the gods. At night, around bonfires, songs were heard of pride and sacrifice, of a collective effort that transcended individual life. The Great Khufu Pyramid, with its more than 2 million stone blocks, was more than a physical challenge, it was an act of absolute faith. Each stone, carefully placed, represented the order that Maat demanded. The architects and mathematicians who designed it were not only building a monument, they were recreating the cosmos on Earth. Astronomical alignments, exact angles, everything was calculated to connect the Earth with heaven. Near it, the pyramids of Khephren and Myserino completed the panorama, each with their own personality and purpose. Khephren, with his pyramid protected by the imposing Sphinx, seemed to look at the horizon with a mixture of challenge and serenity. The Sphinx, half Leon and half human, was a silent guardian, a rock carved in rock that seemed to contain the secrets of the cosmos. Myserino, although smaller, was equally majestic, a reminder that even in an era of absolute greatness, each pharaoh sought to leave their unique brand. The ancient kingdom was an era of incomparable greatness, but also of unwavering faith in the divinity of the pharaoh. These kings were not simply political leaders, they were incarnations of Horus, the Halcyon god, on earth. His words were divine law, his presence a constant reminder that the balance of the universe depended on them. Each ceremony, each decree, was an act that reinforced the connection between the people, the pharaoh, and the gods. But this era was not exempt from challenges. The construction of the pyramids required immense resources, both material and human. The Nile, always generous, fed the workers and facilitated the transport of the stones. However, with each new pyramid, the pressure on the lands and hands increased. There were murmurs in the shadows, concerns that such greatness could be exhausting the abundance that the river had given for so long. And even so, the ancient kingdom continued, driven by a faith that seemed to have no limits. Each stone block, each dark corridor inside the pyramids, spoke of a deep desire, overcome death, transcend time and achieve immortality. For the Egyptians, these structures were not mere monuments, they were the tangible proof that their civilization was destined to last forever. When the sun stood behind the pyramids, projecting long and mysterious shadows on the sand, the Egyptians stopped for a moment to contemplate their work. They knew that they were not only building for themselves, but for the generations that would come, for the gods who observed from above and for the pharaohs who would continue to rule from the hereafter. The pyramids were their legacy, a promise that, while the Nile continues to flow, Egypt would never be forgotten. The magnificence of the ancient kingdom, reflected in the pyramid colossal and in the firm belief in the divinity of the pharaoh, began to show cracks that not even the strongest stones could hide. After centuries of splendor, Egypt faced a bitter reality: even the most glorious kingdoms are subject to the passage of time and wear of their own structures. The power that once flowed like the Nile, joining the whole country under a single scepter, began to fragment. And with that fragmentation, uncertainty arose. The causes of the decline were not sudden, but the result of a slow and constant accumulation of tensions. The pharaohs, once seen as mediators between the gods and men, began to lose their infallibility aura. The construction of huge projects such as pyramids had exhausted state resources. The cultivable fields, essential to feed both workers and the rest of the population, suffered the ravages of inconstant or insufficient flooding. When the Nile did not behave as it should, the crops failed, and hunger extended through the fertile land that once seemed inexhaustible. The people, who had put their faith and their work in the pharaohs, began to question their power. The nomarchs, governors of the provinces known as nomos, took advantage of this void to strengthen their own spheres of influence. What was once a centralized administration began to fall apart, and the provinces began acting as independent kingdoms. Nomarchs, some ambitious and others simply desperate to maintain order in their regions, stopped responding to the central power of Memphis. The pharaoh was no longer the undisputed figure that had been in the time of Cheops and Khephren. Instead, he became a shadow of his ancient greatness, caught between the growing demands of a hungry people and the challenges of the local nobles. The lack of economic resources also weakened the army, which could no longer guarantee border security or maintain internal control. The looting and revolts became increasingly frequent, a sign that the established order was on the verge of collapse. This period, known as the First Intermediate Period, was a time of chaos and fragmentation. Egypt was no longer an indivisible unit, but a mosaic of small regions that competed with each other. In some places, the nomarchs acted as little kings, establishing their own laws and exercising absolute power over their territories. In others, popular discontent became open rebellion. The temples, once symbols of stability and connection with the gods, also suffered, since the resources for their maintenance were exhausted. However, even in the midst of this decline, the Egyptians did not lose their essence. In villages and cities, the people continued to work the earth, praying to the gods and looking for ways to survive. Although chaos seemed to dominate, there was an underlying hope that order could be restored. Some records of the time speak of a divided Egypt, but also of the persistence of traditions and faith in which Maat, universal balance, would prevail again. Art and literature reflect the anguish of this period. The texts, such as the Instructions for Merikare and the Impure Regrets, capture the restlessness of a people that felt that the world they knew crumbled around them. These works not only describe the crisis, but also offer visions of resilience and a future in which Egypt would join under a strong and fair leader. Meanwhile, the ancient gods watched in silence. For the Egyptians, chaos was not something new, it was a force that had always existed, stalking on the margins of order. In its worldview, chaos was an adversary that could never be completely defeated, but that could not prevail forever. This period of fragmentation and struggle would be, for them, a proof, an opportunity for balance to be restored through human effort and divine will. And so, while the Old Kingdom came to an end and Egypt seemed to divide into 1,000 pieces, in the shadows a rebirth began to take shape. The rivalry ties between the nomarchs, the struggle for power and the yearning of unity not only marked the end of an era, but also announced the possibility of a new beginning. The Nile, eternal and serene, continued flowing, carrying with them the promise that Egypt, as always, would find a way to get up once more. The air in Egypt changed, as if the Nile, an eternal witness of the hardships of its people, carried a message of hope. After the dark years of division and chaos, a figure arose that would embody the rebirth of a broken land, Amenemhat I. His name resonated strongly, like a whisper of order in a country that had lost its course. This pharaoh, founder of the 12th dynasty, not only claimed the throne, he claimed the very essence of Egypt, restoring unity and returning faith in Pharaoh as the carrier of Maat. Amenemhat was not a man born to the most prestigious lineage, but his determination and vision elevated him to a legend place. He understood that the chaos of the First Intermediate Period had left deep scars. It was not enough to gather fragmented lands, he had to rebuild the confidence of the people in the pharaonic institution. To do this, he transferred the capital to It-Itori, a city that would become the symbol of a new beginning. From there, he strengthened the borders, reorganized the administration, and assured that each province remembered that the pharaoh was the only guarantor of order. In this rebirth, art took a fascinating turn, reflecting both the anxiety of the past and the hope of the future. The statues and reliefs of the time showed the pharaohs with more human features, as if they recognized that absolute power should be accompanied by responsibility and connection with the people. The artists captured not only greatness, but also the fragility of the human condition, creating works that seemed to look directly into the eyes of those who contemplated them. literature flourished with a renewed intensity. Texts such as the story of Sinu and Amenemhat's instructions offered an intimate look at the life, values, and fears of this new era. In them, the echo of past conflicts felt, but also a conviction that Egypt was destined for something bigger. These works were not only entertainment, they were guides to live according to Maat, reminders that the balance should be cultivated and protected. Religion also evolved during the Middle Kingdom, adapting to times. Although Pharaoh remained the main intermediary between the gods and the people, beliefs began to democratize. The funeral texts, which were previously reserved for the kings, opened to more people, allowing common citizens to aspire to immortality. The text of the sarcophagi emerged as a powerful tool for those who were looking for guidance in the hereafter. Now, not only the pharaohs, but any dignified soul could join the gods and live forever. In this period, the god Amon amounted to the foreground of the Egyptian pantheon, especially in Thebes, where his cult consolidated strongly. Amenemhat and his successors not only supported this cult, but integrated it as an essential part of national identity. Amun, the hidden, became the perfect symbol for an Egypt who had gone from the shadow to light, from the division to unity. The temples dedicated to him were not only religious centers, they were manifestations of new confidence and prosperity. Under the reign of Senusret I, the son of Amenemhat, the country reached a renewed splendor. Foreign expeditions brought wealth and prestige, strengthening trade and expanding borders. Mining in Nubia, the import of cedar wood from Lebanon, and the establishment of diplomatic relations showed that Egypt, although marked by its past, looked to the future with ambition. However, chaos scars were not completely forgotten. The pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom knew that the balance was fragile, that a single error could bring back the disorder. Therefore, each temple built, each decree issued, had the intention of strengthening stability. The people, meanwhile, responded with a renewed fervor. The fertile lands of the Nile flourished under hands, and the murmur of abundant crops was a testimony of recovered peace. At nightfall, when the sun slipped behind the horizon, Egypt seemed to breathe calmly. The stars, constant and eternal, observed from above, as if they approved this rebirth. The Egyptians looked at the river with reverence, knowing that their country, like the Nile, could face storms and, even so, continue flowing. The history of the Middle Kingdom was not only the story of a pharaoh or a dynasty, it was the story of a people that, despite adversities, always found a way to rebirth. Egypt was in its peak, a powerful nation that extended its domains from the Nile River to the distant deserts, with an army that seemed invincible and a wealth that overflowed by every corner of its vast empire. The New Kingdom, the most glorious era in Egyptian history, was a testimony of what happened when the forces of war, faith, and politics joined under the same sky. Thutmose III, known as the Egyptian Napoleon, was the pharaoh that led Egypt to heights never before imagined. His ambition had no limits, and his military ability was legendary. In a series of military campaigns that covered from Syria to Nubia, expanded the borders of Egypt spectacularly. Under his command, the Egyptian army became an unstoppable war machine. The battles were not only victories, but demonstrations of supremacy, of absolute power over the enemy peoples that fell to the Egyptian army as a devastating storm. Thutmose III not only conquered territories, but also ensured its political and economic influence. In his conquests, he was in charge of leaving a cultural footprint. He built temples, raised statues, and established diplomatic relations with other peoples, consolidating Egypt as the lighthouse of civilization. Each victory was reflected in the monuments he erected, who represented not only his glory, but also the power of Egypt before the known world. His most famous campaign, the Battle of Megiddo, showed the strategic cunning of a pharaoh willing to guarantee the Egyptian supremacy. But while Thutmose III consolidated the power of Egypt with fire and sword, a very different pharaoh, Akhenaten, challenged everything Egypt had known. Akhenaten, born Amenephis IV, marked a turning point in the religious history of Egypt by introducing a revolution that would change the nation forever. His life and reign were a total contrast with the war spirit of Thutmose III, and yet, in some way, both pharaohs shared the same passion to transform their country in their own way. Akhenaten, who was originally crowned with the name of Amenephis IV, made a radical decision to challenge the traditional Egyptian polytheistic religion, in which hundreds of gods represented all the forces of nature and the cosmos. Instead, the cult of the stunned solar god, the solar disk, as the supreme deity, established. The pharaoh, which was considered the only intermediary between Aten and men, ordered the construction of a new capital, Akhetaten, today known as Amarna, in honor of its unique god. The change was deep and disruptive, both in the politics and in the religious life of Egypt. Under his reign, the temples dedicated to the traditional gods were abandoned or destroyed, and the representations of the ancient gods were supplanted by symbols of Aten. Akhenaten's image in artistic representations also suffered a transformation, as it was represented with an unusually elongated figure of skinny body and delicate face, which reflected the break with the traditional artistic conventions of Egypt. These representations were very different from those seen in the era of the previous pharaohs, where the figures were idealized with more robust and solemn proportions. Akhenaten's religious revolution was not just a change of cult, it was a declaration of absolute power over the people. Akhenaten looked at himself as the only source of divine truth, the only one who could understand the will to stun and, therefore, control the fate of Egypt. His religious change disrupted the foundations of Egyptian society, which was deeply rooted in the traditional system of the gods and the order established by the previous pharaohs. The priests of Amun, the deity that Egypt had dominated for centuries, were reduced to impotence, and their power evaporated along with the temples that previously belonged to them. However, Akhenaten's religious revolution was not well received by all. Many Egyptians, particularly in the most conservative regions, felt uncomfortable with the sudden abandonment of their old beliefs. The priests of Amun, with their wealth and power, rebelled against the pharaoh, and the Egyptian elite, mostly traditionalist, soon resent the changes. Akhenaten's reign, although brief, was one of the most tumultuous in the history of Egypt. The division between the new capital of Akhetaten and the rest of the country deepened, and at the end of his life, his religious revolution was not enough to keep Egypt unified. When Akhenaten died, his son Tutankhamun, who amounted to the throne at an early age, restored the ancient religion, returning power to the priests of Amun and moving the capital back to Thebes. The reign of Tutankhamun, although not marked by great personal achievements, was crucial for the restoration of religious and political stability in Egypt. However, Akhenaten's revolution left his mark, and the impact of his reign continued to be debated long after his death. At that time, the new kingdom lived its greatest splendor, with a culture, art and religion in constant evolution, driven by pharaohs as diverse as Thutmose III, the conqueror, and Akhenaten, the revolutionary. While one expanded the territories of Egypt and affirmed its war power, the other challenged the religious and cultural traditions that had defined Egyptian identity for millennia. Both, in their own terms, represented the complexity of a civilization that never ceased to reinvent himself, although always under the shadow of the gods, always looking, with each new pharaoh, that balance between order and chaos. The name of Ramses II resonates as an immortal echo through the centuries, loaded with greatness and ambition. Known as Ramses el Grande, this pharaoh not only ruled Egypt for more than 60 years, but also left an indelible mark on its architecture, its policy, and its national spirit. His reign was a bold statement that Egypt was not only powerful, but eternal, a country that did not fear facing its enemies or the passage of time. Ramses II amounted to the throne with the determination to overcome all the pharaohs that preceded him. His vision of immortality resulted in stone, in colossal temples and statues that seemed to touch the sky. Under his mandate, Egypt became a workshop without rest, where working hands carved monuments dedicated to the gods and the pharaoh himself. His masterpiece, Abu Simbel, stands as a testimony of the power and piety of Ramses. This temple's complex, carved directly in the rock, was designed to impress both their subjects and foreign peoples. The huge statues that flanked their entrance, representations of an almost divine Ramses, look at the horizon as if they monitored the entire world. But Ramses did not settle for Abu Simbel. In Thebes, the Ramesseum erected, its mortuary temple, where each wall and column tells stories of its victories and its greatness. There, the inscriptions show it as the chosen one of the gods, a king who not only ruled the earth, but also had a special connection with the divine. These structures were not only expressions of vanity, they were messages to the future, a way of saying, I existed, and Egypt will exist forever. However, Ramses was not just a builder, he was also a warrior. The Battle of Kadesh, one of the most famous clashes in Egyptian history, marked a milestone in his reign. This clash between Egypt and the Hittites in the Kadesh Plains was a struggle for the control of Syria, a strategic region for trade and territorial expansion. Ramses, under the command of a formidable army, faced the challenge with a mixture of courage and cunning. The stories of the battle, registered in the Egyptian temples, narrate how Ramses found himself surrounded by the enemy, separated from most of his army. But instead of yielding to panic, the pharaoh brought together his troops and led a bold counterattack that pushed the Hittites back. Although the battle ended in a tactical draw, Ramses made sure to present it as a glorious victory. Registration shows him as a lonely hero, facing thousands of enemies, protected by the gods. It was a masterpiece of propaganda, designed to strengthen her image as an invincible leader. The cultural impact of Ramses II was not limited to his exploits on the battlefield or his monuments. During his reign, Egypt experienced a rebirth in the arts, literature, and religion. Ramses promoted the restoration of ancient temples, returning its splendor to sacred places that had fallen into oblivion. He also struggled to maintain internal stability, making sure the barns were full and the satisfied people. Under his government, Egypt prospered, and its influence extended from Nubia to Canaan. The figure of Ramses II also influenced the national identity of Egypt. He was a leader who understood the power of the narrative, who knew that his legacy not only depended on his achievements, but also on how they were remembered. When calling himself the Lamodo de Amon, and by constantly associating with the gods, he assured that his name was linked to the very concept of divinity. However, despite his greatness, Ramses was not a perfect ruler. His obsession with leaving a legacy led to excessive expense in construction projects, which in some moments taxed the resources of the kingdom. In addition, its prolonged reign, although beneficial for stability, created tensions among the younger generations that grew under their shadow. At the end of his life, Ramses was an old man or witness of a reign that had transformed Egypt into the center of the known world. When he died, he left a vacuum that no successor could fill completely. His mummy, discovered centuries later, revealed a face marked by age but still imposing, as if even in death his presence continued to be that of an immortal pharaoh. Ramses II not only built temples and led armies, he built an idea, a vision of Egypt as an eternal empire, governed by a leader whose power transcended the human. And while the Nile continues to flow, while the temples are proud of the scorching sun, the spirit of Ramses is still alive, whispering through the stones, "I am Egypt, and Egypt is me." The daily life in ancient Egypt was a tapestry of rhythms that were woven between the gold of the Nile and the endless sand of the desert. On the banks of the great river, where life flourished thanks to the generous annual floods, people lived in ways that reflected both the grandiosity of the empire and the struggles of those who lived in the shadows of the pyramids and temples. In the heart of Egyptian society were the peasants, whose existence revolved around the Nile cycle. They were the true pillars on which the empire rested. Often considered the most humble, the peasants worked the land with an almost religious devotion, knowing that their effort supported the entire country. The Nilo River, which during millennia had given life to Egypt, was also its battlefield, since the floods that watered the culture lands had to be anticipated, understood, and exploited. Agriculture, more than a simple job, was a science, and the peasants, although without the pomp of the pharaohs, possessed a deep knowledge of the earth. The houses of the peasants were simple and functional, built with mud bricks that dried in the sun. They had no luxuries or ornaments, because their life was going on simplicity and need. The interior of the houses was austere, cane beds, woven carpets and mud utensils. The windows were small, they barely let light pass, because in the relentless heat of the day, any shadow was welcome. The families, usually numerous, lived in these small homes and shared almost everything: space, work, and dreams. The peasants' clothes were equally simple, made mainly of linen, which was grown in the lands of the Nile. Men used to wear a simple cover, while women dressed with light robes. Both groups were adorned with simple jewels, usually made of accessible materials, such as clay accounts or local stones. Although the richness of the kingdom was in the big cities and in the palaces, the peasants wore enough not to feel the weight of the sun, but without more. The clothes were always light, as if the skin itself needed to breathe. As for food, the peasants mainly fed on bread, barley, and vegetables. The diet was basic and depended largely on the harvest of the year, since the floods of the Nile directly influenced the quality and quantity of the crops. Bread, basic and simple, was the basis of all meals. The Egyptians used to accompany him with beer, a thick drink made of barley that was consumed by all, from the pharaoh to the peasant. Fruits, such as dates and vegetables, also were part of their daily diet, and fresh Nile fish was a delight that was reserved for special occasions. But at the other end of society, where the sun did not burn so intensely and the waters of the Nile brought wealth, the nobles lived, the elite that fed not only of bread and barley, but of exotic delicacies. The houses of the nobles, built of stone and with courtyards full of leafy gardens, were luxurious and full of life. Their homes not only served as shelters, but as symbols of power. The nobles lived in mansions adorned with fresh, fine ceramics and precious tapestries. Like the pharaohs, they were surrounded by treasures brought from distant territories conquered by the Egyptian army: ivory, gold, cedar wood, precious stones. The clothing of the nobles was, of course, much more luxurious. Lino robes were adorned with embroidery of gold threads, and the use of jewelry was almost mandatory. Gold bracelets, lapis lazuli account necklaces, and rings decorated with precious stones adorned their bodies. The hairstyles were complex and elaborate, often accompanied by fine wigs that showed wealth and social status. The nobles were the true guardians of the Egyptian culture, responsible for directing the country, governing the provinces and, in many cases, of carrying out the complex religious rituals that maintained the cosmic order. But there was another group, one more gloomy, whose life was marked through the yoke of oppression: slaves. In Egypt, slavery was not a novelty, but a daily reality. Slaves were people captured in wars or acquired in distant markets. His life was an endless cycle of work, either in the fields, in the construction of monuments, or at the service of the nobles. The houses of the slaves were the most humble, often built on the outskirts of the great villas, without luxuries or comforts. The slave's dress was not different from that of the peasants: simple linen clothes, often dirty and worn out of hard work. Its diet was basic, similar to that of the peasants, but with less variety and, in many cases, with shortage. Bread and beer were their main sources of livelihood, although they could rarely enjoy the fruits or fish that the peasants considered a luxury. Despite the extreme differences in everyday life, they all shared a common relationship with the Nile. Either on the banks of the river, with the tranquility of the countryside, or in the courtyards of the nobles, with the opulence of the great houses, life in Egypt always revolved around his river. In the humblest homes, dreams fed on the promises of a better life, and in the palaces, the hopes of eternity were woven in the columns of the temples. But throughout Egypt, from the peasants to the pharaohs, the Nile cycle and the search for immortality were the force that driven everyone, regardless of the role they played in the vast and complex Egyptian society. In the land of the Nile, where pyramids rose to heaven and temples were erected as monuments to the gods, Egyptian women played a fundamental role, although often obscured by the shadows of history. They were not mere figures outside society; their lives were intertwined with the fate of the empire, challenging the conventions of their time and leaving a legacy that still resonates in the pages of history. From the most humble to the most powerful, Egyptian women demonstrated their strength, their intelligence, and their ability to govern and transform. One of the most powerful figures of ancient Egypt was Hatshepsut, a woman who challenged the expectations of her time. Like Pharaoh, Hatshepsut ascended the throne for a time when women rarely reached positions of absolute power. However, it was not only a regent, but Pharaoh was proclaimed in his own right, taking the name and titles of a king. With political intelligence and an exceptional sense of leadership, Hatshepsut ruled Egypt for more than 20 years with great success. His reign was characterized by a period of peace and prosperity, during which he promoted ambitious construction projects, such as the Temple of Deir el-Bahari, which remains one of the greatest monuments in Egypt. Despite the challenges he faced as a woman in a world dominated by men, Hatshepsut not only stood out for his effective government, but also for his ability to consolidate his power. In the records, we see it represented with beard and male clothing, elements that reinforced their image as an absolute leader, along with any male pharaoh. With a vision of the future that transcended his time, Hatshepsut showed that women could not only reign, but to do it with wisdom and skill, like any man on the throne. Following the wake of powerful women like Hatshepsut, Egypt was also the home of Cleopatra VII, one of the most emblematic and fascinating figures in history. Cleopatra, known for his intelligence, his political cunning and his ability to ally with the most powerful men of his time, such as Julio Caesar and Marco Antonio, ruled Egypt in a time of great turbulence. His life was a scenario of intrigue, romance, and power, and his figure has endured over the centuries as a symbol of women's struggle for power in a world of men. Although Cleopatra was born in a family of Hellenistic kings who ruled Egypt, their ability to adapt to Egyptian culture and win the loyalty of the people was what really distinguished it. He dominated several languages and thoroughly understood the internal and external policy of the country. Unlike many monarchs of his time, he was not only a queen by inheritance, but a strategist who used his political power and his personal attraction to keep Egypt independent in a world marked by the ambitions of Rome. His relationship with Caesar and his romance with Marco Antonio marked his reign, but his ability to maintain the independence of Egypt was what really caused his figure to be admired and feared. However, despite these examples of absolute power, most Egyptian women were not pharaohs or legendary figures. In everyday life, women occupied a variety of roles in the family and society. Marriage was one of the most important institutions in the lives of Egyptian women. Although women did not have the same rights as men in all aspects of public life, within the home they had a respected position. Marriage was a union that looked as much as a spiritual association as a practical need, and women performed crucial roles such as wives, mothers, and household administrators. Egyptian women could marry at an early age, generally between 12 and 14 years, and it was expected that, like men, they had a family. The role of women as a mother was central in Egyptian society, and mothers were highly valued, especially those that could ensure real lineage. However, although marriage and motherhood were essential aspects of female life, women also enjoyed certain legal rights that allowed them to have a relatively independent life compared to other cultures of the time. For example, Egyptian women had the ability to have properties, inherit goods, and make commercial transactions. They could file demands before the courts, sign contracts, and witness in the trials. This ability to participate in the legal aspects of life was not common in many other ancient civilizations. In fact, some women reached considerable economic independence, especially if they were not married or if they were widowed, since they could administer their own goods and make financial decisions. Despite this, women were still limited in many ways, and the highest classes were the ones that mostly enjoyed these privileges. The women of the lower classes, especially the peasants, led a much harder life, focused on home tasks and work in the fields. Despite this, women of all classes had a fundamental role in the transmission of Egyptian culture, especially in the education of children, which was seen as a sacred obligation. In addition to their role in the family, some Egyptian women performed important functions in religion. There were priestesses in the temples, some of which had a considerable influence. Although the upper priesthood was generally reserved for men, women could also reach high ranges within the cults dedicated to goddesses such as Isis, Hathor, and Bastet. In fact, the cult of Isis, which represented motherhood, love, and fertility, was particularly linked to the female figure, and its priestesses enjoyed significant respect. In summary, although women in ancient Egypt did not always enjoy the power and visibility of figures such as Hatshepsut or Cleopatra, they had a fundamental role in society. They were guardians of culture, caregivers of traditions, and, in many cases, power figures in their own communities. From the queens that ruled to the women who maintained the home, the role of the Egyptian woman was crucial for the functioning of the empire, and its influence remained feeling long after the Nile stopped flowing with the same force. In the vast and eternal landscape of ancient Egypt, where the Nile cuts the fertile land as a river of life, education and writing were the tools that transformed the Egyptians into a civilization that not only dominated their time, but left an immortal legacy. The invention of the hieroglyphs, the oldest and fascinating writing system in history, marked the beginning of an era in which words not only served to communicate, but also to pay tribute to the gods, preserve knowledge and build the future. The hieroglyphs were not simple symbols, they were a sacred, almost magical language. Their strokes, made with precision and delicacy, told stories, narrated myths and registered feats. For the Egyptians, writing was more than a communication tool, it was a bridge between the divine and the human. The gods themselves, like Thoth, the god of wisdom and writing, were the true guardians of this art. It was through the words that the pharaohs connected with the divine, that the priests maintained the cosmic order, and that the story was preserved for the coming generations. The creation of hieroglyphs was not an isolated or sudden process. It arose as a need in an advanced society, where trade, administration, and religion required a means to organize and register vast amounts of information. The first signs were recorded in the tombs and temples, where pharaohs and priests wanted to ensure that their names and achievements live forever. Little by little, hieroglyphs were evolving, becoming a complex system that combined symbols of sounds, ideas, and objects. Each hieroglyph could represent a word, an idea, or a syllable, and its meaning was understood only in the right context. The fact that a society could develop such a sophisticated writing system speaks of ingenuity and organization of the Egyptians. It wasn't something accessible to all. To learn to read and write, young people had to enter schools, knowledge centers deeply linked to temples and palaces. But this access was not for everyone. Only the children of the elite or those with exceptional abilities could access these places of learning. The writing classes were strictly taught, and the students spent years learning not only the hieroglyphs, but also the rules of grammar, literature, and religious traditions. In these schools, future scribes were formed in the art of writing and maintaining registration of everything that happened in Egypt. Writing was not only used to register events, but also to preserve laws, contracts, and religious teachings. The scribes were much more than simple editors, they were the guardians of knowledge. His work was loaded with responsibility. They were responsible for writing the decisions of the pharaoh, registering offerings to the gods, and maintaining the archives of the royal court. In cities, they were essential for administrative functions, and without them, the empire could not have worked with the same efficiency. The scribes were venerated figures in Egyptian society, and often looked as higher beings, almost as intermediaries between men and the gods. Their ability to write and read the hieroglyphs gave them a unique power. The scribes were fundamental for the organization of the empire, from the collection of taxes to the maintenance of historical records. In a country where memory and tradition were essential, the scribes were those who assured that nothing was lost, that the stories, laws, and decisions endured throughout generations. Despite their status, the scribes were not necessarily rich or powerful. Many of them came from humble families, but the domain of writing gave them a social status that other workers had. They could live relatively comfortable lives, but their true wealth was in knowledge. They were respected, they were granted a special place in society, and in many cases, they were in charge of writing inscriptions in monuments or tombs, ensuring that pharaohs and nobles lived forever through words. However, not all hieroglyphs were only of administrative or religious importance. The Egyptians also used writing for the fine arts. Egyptian literary texts, such as love stories, poems, and stories of the gods, were recorded in papyrus rolls. The writers not only narrated historical or religious facts, but also reflected the thoughts and feelings of the Egyptian people. Egyptian literature has left us a rich inheritance of wisdom, from the famous texts of the pyramids, which are the oldest known religious texts, to the texts of the sarcophagi, and the tales of the court, which they offer fascinating glimpses of the life and mentality of ancient Egypt. Education was not only a means to achieve knowledge. In a world where eternity was such a deeply rooted concept in Egyptian culture, learning to write also meant having a place in posterity. The work of a scribe was an act of faith. When registering the achievements of a pharaoh or the exploits of a god, the scribe participated in the creation of a story that would never die. Through their pen, they shaped a civilization that would last beyond life itself. And so, while the sands of time devour the traces of the past, the hieroglyphs remain engraved on the stones and in the tombs. In each line, in each symbol, the essence of a people who understood the power of the word, a people who built an empire with more than just stones and hierarchies. He built an immortal legacy with writing, the divine tool that connected to humans with the gods. The figure of the scribe, erect on the old stones, remains the image of Egypt itself, a people that, with the power of the word, became eternal. In the vast canvas of history, few civilizations have left a mark as deep as ancient Egypt, where art and architecture were not only expressions of creativity, but manifestations of the very soul of a people. Each line drawn, each stone placed, each color applied was a declaration of power, of faith, and eternity. Egyptian art and architecture, they were not mere decorations, they were a language, a bridge between humans and the gods, a promise recorded in stone and pigment that life after death would be as glorious as earthly life was. Egyptian sculptures, with their imposing force and eternal serenity, speak to us even from the shadows of the past. The artists worked with mathematical precision, guided by a deep respect for proportions and symmetry. It was not simple vanity that motivated them, but an attempt to capture the divine order, the balance of the universe, the concept of Maat that governed his world. The statues of the pharaohs, with their inexpressive faces and their rigid poses, did not seek to portray the person as it was, but as it should be, an eternal, immortal being, a reflection of divinity. The pharaohs were represented as colossal figures, with a stillness that was not a lack of life, but an echo of eternity. Think of Memnon's colossi, who still rise on the Theban plain, witnesses of a time when men saw themselves as participants in the cosmos. The hardness of the materials, granito, basalto, diorite, was not accidental. Each sculpture was conceived to resist the forces of time and ensure that the spirit of the represented never disappeared from the world. Egyptian painting, on the other hand, was deployed with a liveliness and a symbolism that sought to tell stories beyond words. The walls of the tombs and temples were canvases where the daily life, the exploits of the gods, and the promises of the other life were interwoven in a dance of colors and shapes. The artists did not seek realism, but to transmit ideas. The human figures, for example, were painted following a canon, the faces and legs in profile, but the torsos in front. This style was not a limitation, but a way to ensure that each part of the body was recognizable, so that the spirit could use it in eternity. The colors in these paintings were not mere ornaments, but symbols loaded with meaning. Green represented fertility and renewal, black evoked the richness of earth and life after death, blue remembered the sky and the Nile, a source of all life. Every detail, every tone, was a code that connected the living with the gods and the dead with their rebirth. In the scenes painted in the tombs, the pharaohs were shown hunting, sailing, or surrounded by offerings, as if their souls were going to continue living those experiences forever. But if the sculptures and paintings were the language of the soul, the temples and the tombs were the scenarios where this language came to life. The tombs were not simple places of rest, they were complete worlds, built to accompany the deceased on his journey to eternity. The dark halls were filled with hieroglyphs that narrated the prayers necessary to overcome the trials of the underworld. Funeral cameras were filled with offerings, furniture, weapons, and jewels, everything that the soul could need to live forever in the other life. The pyramids of the Old Kingdom, those colossal structures that still rise challenging time, were much more than tombs, they were statements of power and faith. Built with impressive geometric precision, these structures reflected the organization's ability to organization with its spirituality. Each block placed, each calculated angle, was an act of devotion to the pharaoh, who not only ruled as a man, but as a living god. The temple, meanwhile, was the throbbing heart of the Egyptian religion. Each temple was a microcosm, a stone reflection of the universe as the Egyptians understood. From the majestic pylons that marked the entrance to the dark internal sanctuaries where only the priests could enter, every corner of the temple was designed to inspire reverence. The reliefs carved on the walls were not simple decorations, they were records of rituals, hymns to the gods, stories of victories and offerings that the pharaohs made to ensure the prosperity of Egypt. In Karnak, for example, the huge obelisks and the columns of the great Hypostilo Hall immerse us in a stone forest where light and shadow play as if the gods themselves breathe between the halls. This was not just a place of worship, it was a statement of the greatness of the pharaohs and a reminder of the role of Egypt as axis of the cosmos. In Abu Simbel, the temples of Ramses II seem to arise directly from the rocks, with their colossal statues watching the horizon. Here, the power of the pharaoh is presented as something inseparable from the power of the gods. Egyptian architecture was deeply influenced by nature. The columns, for example, were often sculpted as you do papyri or lotus, reflecting the flora of the Nile. The temples of the temples they were blue with golden stars, recreating the night sky. Even the pyramids, with their ascending lines, seemed to imitate the sun's rays, guiding the soul of the pharaoh towards heaven to meet with Ra, the solar god. As one walks between the ruins of Egypt, it is impossible not to feel the weight of a people who believed that art and architecture could challenge mortality. Each stone placed, each sculpted figure, each pigment applied was an act of faith, a whisper to the infinity. In temples and tombs, in sculptures and paintings, the Egyptians not only left a testimony of their time, but a reflection of their eternity. An eternity that, despite the passage of millennia, still resonates in every corner where its legacy is still standing. In ancient Egypt, medicine and science were like two branches of a sacred tree, deeply intertwined with everyday life and spirituality. The Egyptians did not separate the practical knowledge of mysticism, but rather interwoven to create a system of beliefs and practices that the body and the spirit addressed. His approach was extraordinarily advanced for his time, a fusion of empirical observation and sacred ritual that marked the pattern for the development of medicine and exact sciences in later centuries. The Egyptian doctors, known as SWNW, were respected figures that specialized in various branches of health. Some focused on the treatment of wounds and fractures, while others were experts in internal ailments, eye diseases, or even gynecology. This specialization reveals a degree of organization and knowledge that few would imagine possible in such an ancient civilization. One of the most famous medical texts, Ebers Papyrus, is a true treasure of medical wisdom, with detailed descriptions of diagnoses and treatments for everything, from infections to digestive problems. The Egyptians understood that the human body was a complex system of channels, an idea that seems to prefigure the modern concepts of the circulation and the function of the organs. If one of these channels was blocked, the disease appeared, and the objective of the treatment was to restore the natural flow. To achieve this, doctors used a variety of natural remedies, many of which were surprisingly effective. The use of honey to treat infected wounds, for example, was a practice advanced to their time, since honey has antibacterial properties that the Egyptians, although they did not know the concept of bacteria, understood intuitively. However, Egyptian medicine was not purely scientific. Doctors also resorted to spells, amulets, and rituals to accompany their treatments. They believed that diseases were not just a physical problem, but could also be caused by evil spirits or the wrath of the gods. For this reason, the priest's medical played a crucial role in the Egyptian health system. Healing was both a practical act and a spiritual ceremony, and the patient should be in harmony with Maat, the cosmic balance, to heal. As for science, the Egyptians showed an impressive domain in astronomy and mathematics. The night sky, with its vastness and mystery, was a constant source of inspiration and knowledge. Egyptian astronomers not only studied the stars out of curiosity, but because they believed that heavenly movements directly influenced life on Earth. They observed the Sirian cycle, the brightest star in the sky, and related it to the annual flood of the Nile, a vital event for agriculture and survival. This astronomical knowledge was the basis for the creation of a 365-day solar calendar, an innovation that we still use today. The precision of its astronomical observations was also reflected in its architecture. The temples and pyramids aligned with the cardinal points and with specific celestial phenomena. The Egyptians understood that the orientation of these structures was not only an aesthetic whim, but a way of connecting the Earth with the cosmos. Each construction was an act of synchronization with the universe, a way to ensure that the cosmic order remained intact. Mathematics, meanwhile, were an essential tool in everyday life and in great construction works. The Egyptians developed a numeric system based on powers of 10, with simple symbols to represent specific numbers. This system allowed them to perform complex calculations necessary for the construction of pyramids, temples, and channels. The geometry was particularly important, since it helped them to measure and divide agricultural land, calculate volumes, and design monumental structures with impressive precision. A remarkable example of his mathematical ingenuity is the way in which Ella grated to build the pyramids, colossal structures that remain a mystery for many. Although the Egyptians had no modern tools, their understanding of proportions, angles, and physics allowed them to erect these architectural wonders with accuracy that amazes contemporary engineers. Each stone block was cut and placed with millimeter accuracy, a testimony of its mathematical and organizational ability. But it was not only calculation and construction. The Egyptians also understood the symbolism inherent to geometric shapes. The triangle, for example, represented the trinity of the gods, humans, and the cosmos, while the circle evoked eternity. In his hands, mathematics became more than numbers, it was a sacred language, a way of communicating transcendental ideas. The combination of medicine, astronomy, and mathematics in Egypt not only improved the lives of people of their time, but also laid the foundations for the scientific advances of future generations. Each papyrus, each star observed, every calculation made, was a step towards a deeper understanding of the world and its place in it. This knowledge, carefully preserved and transmitted, transcended the borders of time, influencing the cultures that came later. In the golden sands of Egypt, where the past and the present converge, the medical and scientific contributions of this civilization still resonate. In each modern discovery that brings us closer to the understanding of the universe, there is an echo of those ancient sages that, with simple tools and an unwavering faith in the cosmic order, illuminated the way for humanity. In the heart of Egyptian life, a pantheon of gods and goddesses representing cosmic forces, natural phenomena, and aspects of daily life was beaten. The ancient Egyptians did not see their gods as distant entities, but as living presences that lived in their world, influencing every detail of their days. Each dawning, every flood of the Nile, and each star in heaven was an expression of the divine will. Worship and appeasing these gods was essential to maintain the balance of Maat, the order held by the universe. Ra, the god of the sun, was one of the fundamental pillars of the Egyptian pantheon. It represented light, life, and creation, and it was believed that it was sailing through the sky in its solar boat during the day, only to face the forces of chaos in the underworld during the night. Each dawning was a renewed victory of Ra over darkness, a daily reminder of the triumph of order over chaos. The priests in the temples dedicated to Ra performed rituals elaborated at dawn, lighting incense and reciting hymns while the first rays of sun illuminated the golden statues of God. Osiris, on the other hand, was the lord of the dead and the symbol of the resurrection. His story was one of the most powerful narratives of ancient Egypt. Betrayed and killed by his brother Seth, Osiris was restored to life by his wife, Isis, and became the judge of souls in the underworld. For the Egyptians, Osiris not only represented life expectancy after death, but also the regeneration of the earth after the floods of the Nile. The ceremonies in their honor were intensely emotional, with processions and dramatizations of his death and resurrection that united to the faithful in a deep spiritual connection. Isis, the great magician and divine mother, was worshipped as protector of pharaohs and households. Her devotion to Osiris and her role as the mother of Horus made her a model of love and strength. Egyptian women saw in Isis a reflection of themselves, and amulets with their image were common to guarantee protection and fertility. In the temples dedicated to her, the priestesses sang soft songs, creating an environment of reverence and comfort that enveloped everyone present. Horus, the son of Osiris and Isis, symbolized the triumph of good over evil. Represented as a hawk or a man with a hawk, Horus was the god of heaven and the protector of the pharaoh, who was considered his incarnation on earth. Horus's famous struggle against Seth, his father's murderer, resonated in the hearts of the Egyptians as a history of justice and redemption. The ceremonies in their honor were vigorous, with dances and offerings that evoked their strength and courage. The cult of these gods was not a sporadic activity, it was an integral part of daily life. In temples, priests played a crucial role as intermediaries between gods and humans. Every morning, the statues of the gods were bathed, anointed with oils and dressed in elaborate clothes. Foods, perfumes and flowers were offered, not as simple courtesy acts, but as gestures to guarantee prosperity and balance on earth. Outside the temples, families also honored the gods in their homes. Small altars decorated with figures of the gods were the center of daily prayers and offerings. The incense burned, the lamps lit, and the Egyptians requested protection, health, and blessings for their loved ones. Even in the humblest moments, such as working in the fields or navigating the Nile, the Egyptians felt the presence of the divine, whispering prayers under the open sky. The Egyptian pantheon was not static, it evolved, adapting to the changing needs and beliefs of society. New gods emerged, and the ancients acquired new meanings, reflecting the wealth and complexity of a culture deeply connected to the sacred. In each statue and temple, in each anthem and ritual, ancient Egypt left us a testimony of its unwavering faith in the power of the divine. It all started in the abyss, a vast ocean of darkness known as Nun, where there was neither time nor the form. The ancient Egyptians imagined this primary state as a place where everything was potential and nothing was defined, a deep chaos that expected to be molded. From that immensity, Ra emerged, the god of the sun, like a spark of light that broke the monotony of nothing. Ra not only brought clarity, but it was also the origin of life and the principle of all creation. According to the stories, Ra created himself, an act of pure divine will. It emerged on a primary hill, a mound that emerged from the waters as the first piece of earth. This act marked the beginning of the world as we know it. In his solitude, Ra decided to populate the universe, and from his breath, Shu, the god of the air, and Tefnut, the goddess of moisture, were born. Shu and Tefnut represented the essential elements that would maintain the balance of the cosmos. Over time, Shu and Tefnut gave life to Geb, the god of the earth, and Nut, the goddess of heaven. But the order was not easy to establish. Geb and Nut, although deeply in love, were separated by Shu, who kept them at a distance, raising Nut to heaven and leaving Geb down like the earth. This separation was not a punishment, but a cosmic need for a space where life could prosper. From this celestial and earthly union were born the first gods that would form the Enneada, a group of 9 divinities that symbolized the fundamental principles of the universe. Among them were Osiris, Isis, Seth, and Nephthys, whose subsequent stories would shape the traditions and beliefs of Egypt. Osiris became the symbol of renewal, while Seth represented the chaos necessary for change. Isis, with his love and wisdom, acted as the glue that kept everything together. At the same time, in another version of the myth known as the Ogdode, the inhabitants of Hermopolis imagined a different but equally captivating origin. Here, 8 primary deities, divided into couples, personified aspects of chaos before creation. There was Nun and Nornit, the water, Kuk and Korkit, darkness, He and Horhet, infinity, and Amun and Amornit, the hidden. These forces worked together to bring the first spark of light, symbolizing the transition from chaos to order. Both myths, although different, shared a common purpose, to explain how the universe went from chaos to the organization. In the heart of these stories was the idea that order was fragile and always stalked by chaos, but that the gods constantly worked to maintain it. This was not just a mythical story, but a philosophy that permeated every aspect of Egyptian life, from religious rituals to the laws of society. The creation process did not end with the establishment of heaven, earth, and the gods. Ra, like the great creator, felt the need to train humanity. According to some stories, Ra tears, spilled in a moment of deep reflection, fell on earth and gave life to the first men and women. This idea underlined the connection between the gods and humans, who were not mere spectators in the cosmos, but active participants in the maintenance of Maat, the universal balance. Creation, for the Egyptians, was not a unique event, but a continuous act. Every dawn, when Ra was sailed through the sky in his solar boat, it was a reminder that the light continued to triumph over the dark. Each flood of the Nile, with its renewed fertility, was seen as a recreation of the world. The repetition of these cycles gave the Egyptians a sense of stability in a universe that, although ordered, was always on the edge of chaos. These stories not only filled the gaps of knowledge about the origin of the universe, but also offered comfort. In a world full of uncertainty, creation myths gave a purpose and a sentido of belonging, an unwavering connection with the gods who had shaped the existence itself. In the heart of Egyptian beliefs, an eternal cycle of death and resurrection, a dance between darkness and the light that defined not only the fate of the gods, but also that of men. This cycle found its maximum expression in the moving history of Osiris and Isis, a story that deeply resonated in the soul of all the Egyptians and gave meaning to the mysteries of life and death. Osiris, the fair and wise king of Egypt, was loved by his people and reverenced as the bearer of civilization. Under his government, the earth flourished, the waters of the Nile brought fertility, and justice prevailed. But this harmony was not destined to last. Seth, his brother, moved by envy and ambition, warned a dark plan to end him. With deception, Seth caught Osiris in a chest and threw him into the Nile, letting the waters take him, as if he wanted to erase a full mark of his existence. The tragedy seemed definitive, but Isis, Osiris's faithful wife, did not resign. With a fierce determination, he sought his beloved body throughout Egypt. His pain was that of an entire nation, but his hope was stronger than any despair. Finally, He found it, and with the help of Nephthys, his sister, and Anubis' magical knowledge, began the process of returning his life. The words of ancient hymns describe how Isis, with their love and spell. Osiris then became the lord of the Duat, the underworld, where he presided over the trials of souls. His death and resurrection were not just a myth, but a cosmic model. For the Egyptians, Osiris symbolized the promise of eternal life, the certainty that death was not the end, but a step towards a renewed existence. This myth had a powerful echo in the funeral rituals of Egypt. Death, far from being feared, was seen as a transition, a journey towards a higher state of existence. The bodies of the deceased were treated with extreme reverence, following a process that not only preserved the physical, but also guaranteed the protection of the soul. The mummification, an art perfected over centuries, was the center of these preparations. The process began with the purification of the body, which was washed with water from the Nile, as if you wanted to reconnect the deceased with the origin of all life. Then, the internal organs, except the heart, were carefully extracted and placed in canopy vessels, each protected by a son of Horus. The heart, considered the seat of consciousness, remained in place, as it would be judged in the hereafter. The body was dehydrated with natron and wrapped in thin flawless bands, each layer accompanied by amulets and enchantments aimed at protecting the deceased on his trip to the Duat. The funeral texts, such as the Book of the Dead, served as guides for the soul, providing precise instructions to navigate the dangers of the underworld and overcome the evidence that guaranteed access to eternal life. In the final judgment, the heart of the deceased was heavy in a balance against the Maat pen, symbol of truth and balance. If the heart was pure, the soul was admitted in the fields of Yaru, a paradise of abundance where life continued in eternal harmony. If not, it was devoured by Atum, a terrifying being who ended the existence of the soul. The Osiris cycle and associated rituals reflected a deeply optimistic vision of death. For the Egyptians, dying was not to disappear, but to transform, follow the path drawn by Osiris and reborn in a world beyond time. It was a comfort that supported an entire civilization in the face of the uncertainty of the unknown. In each carefully preserved mummy, in each amulet placed with devotion, and in each prayer whispered on the edge of the tomb, the immortal spirit of Osiris was still alive, guiding the living and the dead towards eternity. In the silent and mysterious Duat, the Egyptian underworld, one of the most solemn and decisive moments of all existence was carried out, the judgment of the dead. This judgment was not only a fate reserved for pharaohs or the nobles, but a universal experience for each soul that aspired to eternity. The weight of an entire life was measured in an act of cosmic justice, where Maat, the principle of order, truth, and harmony, was the supreme judge. The deceased, after passing through the dark and dangerous landscapes of the Duat, arrived at the Hall of the Two Truths, a sacred space full of solemnity. In this place, Anubis, the god with the head of a jackal, presided over the ritual of the heart's eye. Anubis now are only a guardian of the underworld, but also the protector of the dead, who guided souls and assured that the trial was fair. With his delicate hands, he placed the heart of the deceased in a salary dish, while in the other rested the pen of Maat, light and pure. The heart, for the Egyptians, was the seat of emotions, thoughts, and actions. It contained the truth of the life that the deceased had led. If this heart was heavy due to the weight of lies, betrayals, or selfishness, the balance was inclined, and the sentence was devastating. Atum, a hybrid and terrifying being with crocodile head, leon torso and hippo rear, he waited anxiously at the edge of the living room. If the heart was impure, Atum devoured him, condemning the soul to eternal oblivion, a destination worse than death itself. However, if the heart was balanced with Maat's pen, the soul was declared fair and deserving of continuing his journey to eternity. This moment was sublime, full of hope and triumph. The soul was taken to Osiris, the god of the underworld, who, sitting on his throne wrapped in white bandages, granted access to the fields of Yaru, a paradise where life continued in perfect harmony. There, the deceased would enjoy an endless existence, surrounded by abundance and serenity, working in the fertile fields of the beyond with the help of the Ushebtis, small figures that would serve him faithfully. The Book of the Dead, known as the Emheru in Egyptian, was an essential guide for this process. This sacred text was not a unique book, but a collection of hymns, prayers, and spells that helped the deceased to overcome the dangers of the Duat and to perform properly before the gods. Each copy of the Book of the Dead was personalized, written in papyri and decorated with detailed illustrations that reflected the beliefs and hopes of the deceased. Among the best-known passages was the Negative Confession, a set of statements that the soul should pronounce before the 40-2 divine judges of the underworld. In this confession, the deceased claimed not to have committed unworthy acts, such as stealing, lying, or causing harm. These words were not only a testimony of their behavior, but also a reminder of the fundamental values that governed Egyptian life. The trial was not a punishment or arbitrary evidence, but an extension of Maat, the principle that shapes the universe. Living in harmony with Maat during earthly life was the preparation for this decisive moment. The Egyptians believed that their actions, even the smallest, had a weight in the cosmic balance, and their desire for justice and righteousness was deeply rooted in their worldview. The scene of the Dead of the Dead, represented in countless tombs and papyri, was more than a warning. It was a symbol of hope and redemption, a promise that a fair life would be rewarded with eternity. In each heart that was placed in the balance, the Egyptians saw the reflection of their own humanity, fragile and sublime, seeking the balance between the earthly and the divine. In the throbbing heart of Egyptian life were the festivities and rituals, a constant flow of celebrations that linked to the community and strengthened the link between mortals and the gods. Each holiday was a sacred dance between the human and the divine, a reminder that the Egyptians not only lived under the protection of their deities, but were also active participants in the maintenance of the cosmic balance. The festivities were not simple acts of devotion, but events that permeated all aspects of everyday life. In big cities like Thebes or Memphis, the streets became rivers of joy and devotion. Music resonated in every corner, the drums and flutes marked the rhythm while sacred songs filled the air. The people, dressed in their best galas, came out in mass to participate in processions, ceremonies, and community banquets that extended the sensation of union and belonging. One of the most anticipated events was Opit's Party, a celebration dedicated to Amun, the powerful god of Thebes. During this holiday, which could last weeks, the statue of Amun, carefully stored in its sanctuary, was taken in procession from the Karnak temple to the temple of Luxor. This tour, accompanied by priests, musicians, and a fervent crowd, symbolized the renewal of the pharaoh's power and his sacred link with the gods. The ceremonial boat that transported the statue floated majestically through the Nile River, joining the temples as if they were the nerves of a divine body. Another significant event was the Party of Thirst, in honor of Hathor, the goddess of love, music, and fertility. This celebration not only had a religious, but also social character. It was a time for a get out, drink wine, and enjoy dance and music shows, all under Hathor's blessing. The Egyptians saw at this party an opportunity to renew their family and community ties, celebrating the joy of life that Hathor symbolized. In the funeral field, the festivities also played a crucial role. Osiris Beauty Festival, for example, marked the death and resurrection of God. The participants recreated the suffering of Osiris and the tireless search for Isis to return to life. This cosmic drama was represented with processions in which the devotees carried images of Osiris, followed by offerings of flowers, food, and perfumes. It was a reminder not only of the eternal cycle of death and rebirth, but also of the hope of an eternal life for all. The daily rituals in the temples were equally important, although less spectacular. The priests played an essential role in these ceremonies, which assured that the gods were satisfied and the cosmic balance remained. At dawn, the statue of deity was awakened in an act that mixed the mundane with the sacred. It was bathed, dressed, and scented before receiving offerings of food, water, and music. Although the laity did not have access to these intimate ceremonies, they trusted that the priests acted in the name of the entire community. Purification rituals were also essential, especially during important festivities. Nile's water, considered sacred, was used to clean both people and ritual objects. This act symbolized not only physical cleaning, but also spiritual renewal. The offerings, which could include bread, beer, fruits, and lotus flowers, were arranged on altars with exquisite care, reflecting the devotion of the people. Art and architecture also played an important role in these festivities. The temples were not only places of worship, but scenarios designed to amplify the impact of ceremonies. The walls carved with reliefs narrated the myths related to the festivities, allowing even those who did not participate directly feel their meaning. Through these celebrations and rituals, the Egyptians not only expressed their faith, but also their sense of collective identity. The festivities marked the passage of time, intertwining with the cycles of nature and the stations of the Nile. In each song, each dance, and each offering, the very essence of its existence was reflected, to live in harmony with the gods, nature, and among themselves. Under the clear sky of Egypt, where the sun raised with an imposing majesty, pyramids were erected, monuments that challenged time and talked about the greatness of an incomparable civilization. These colossal structures, wrapped in mystery and astonishment, were not only masterpieces of engineering, but also deep reflections of a spiritual connection with the cosmos and with the gods. On the Giza horizon, 3 stone giants dominated the landscape, the pyramids of Cheops, Khephren, and Mycerino. Built more than 4,500 years ago, these wonders were conceived not only as tombs, but as eternal portals towards immortality. The ancient Egyptians firmly believed that life did not end death, but continued in a kingdom beyond the visible, and the pyramids were the vehicle that secured that sacred transit for their pharaohs. The design of the pyramids was a boast of geometric and symbolic perfection. The square base represented the stability of the earth, while the triangular faces that converged in the cusp pointed to the sky, connecting the earthly with the divine. The exact orientation of these structures towards the cardinal points was not an accident, it was a testimony of advanced astronomy knowledge that the Egyptians possessed. The Syrian star, whose glow marked the annual flood of the Nile, was a crucial element in pyramid planning, underlining its cosmic purpose. The process of building these wonders remains an enigma that has baffled archaeologists and engineers for centuries. There is talks of thousands of workers, organized in meticulously coordinated teams, which dedicated decades to move stone blocks that could weigh up to 70 tons. Although rudimentary tools were used, such as copper chisels and wooden levers, the Egyptians showed a technical skill that challenged the limitations of their time. Inclined ramps, wooden rollers, and an amazing understanding of physics were combined to create these structures that seemed to touch the sky. Beyond their function as tombs, the pyramids had a deeply religious and symbolic meaning. Each of them was a temple of transformation, a place where Pharaoh, considered a god on earth, ascended to the kingdom of the gods after his death. The sacred texts, such as the texts of the pyramids recorded on the walls of the funeral cameras, detailed the rituals and enchantments that ensured the protection of the pharaoh and its integration into eternity. These inscriptions were more than words, they were promises of immortality, vibrant of spiritual power. The Great Cheops Pyramid, the greatest and most majestic of all, remains an impressive testimony of this vision. Originally covered with polished white limestone, reflected sunlight as if it were a star fallen to earth. Its height, which reached 146 meters, seemed to challenge the severity itself. Inside, the king's chamber, carefully designed with granito da Assuan, housed the pharaoh sarcophagus, surrounded by almost supernatural silence that still resonates today. The symbolism of the pyramids went beyond the individual pharaoh. They were a reminder for the whole society of the importance of Maat, the beginning of the universal order. Building were not only an act of devotion to Pharaoh and the gods, but also a commitment to the stability and continuity of the cosmos. Each stone block placed in its place was an act of faith, a statement that the balance between the human, the divine, and nature should be preserved. The impact of the pyramids was not limited to their time. His legacy endures as a universal symbol of what humanity can achieve when combining imagination, skill, and faith. Even today, when the wind whispers between the stones and the sun projects shadows that seem to tell ancient stories, the pyramids remain a reminder of the greatness and mystery that defines our existence. They are much more than monuments, they are doors to the eternal, witnesses of a dream that, against all prognosis, came true in the sands of Egypt. In a corner section of the Egyptian desert, where the rocky mountains rise as eternal guardians, is the Valley of the Kings, a place wrapped in mystery and reverence. This valley, chosen by the pharaohs of the New Kingdom as its eternal abode, keeps tombs that tell stories of power, ambition, and a deep desire to transcend mortality. It is here where the earthly and the divine are intertwined, leaving a legacy that continues to captivate the world. For centuries, the pharaohs and their architects abandoned the tradition of building monumental pyramids, instead looking for a more discreet but equally imposing refuge. The Valley of the Kings, located on the western shore of the Nile near Thebes, became the ideal place. Its arid hills offered not only natural isolation, but also the symbolic protection of the solar god, whose life and death cycle resonated on the eternal journey that the pharaohs yearned. The tombs excavated in the rock were not simple graves, they were true masterpieces of art and spirituality. Serpentient corridors and inner cameras were decorated with paintings and reliefs that represented the duat, the underworld, and the sacred texts that guided the pharaoh on their journey to eternity. The walls vibrated with bright colors, the deep blue of the night sky, the bright gold of the sun, and the reddish tones that evoked the vital blood of regeneration. Each brushstroke was a prayer, a whisper of hope in the gloom. However, the Valley of the Kings also witnessed a story of looting and loss. Despite the efforts to hide the graves and protect their treasures, many were raped by thieves in search of wealth. The bodies of the pharaohs, which once lying surrounded by gold and offerings, were displaced and their desecrated graves. For centuries, the valley remained silent, its forgotten glory, until an extraordinary finding revived its splendor. In November 1922, a British archaeologist named Howard Carter broke that silence. After years of tireless search and frustrations, Carter and his team finally discovered the intact tomb of a young pharaoh, Tutankhamun. When opening a small hole in the sealed entrance of the grave, Carter illuminated the interior with a candle. What he saw left the world breathless. There were treasures beyond the imagination, golden statues, jewelry, furniture, and the sarcophagus of the young king, all intact, as if time had stopped his course. The funeral mask of Tutankhamun, made of solid gold and decorated with semi-precious stones, became a universal symbol of the Egyptian magnificence. But beyond its beauty, the tomb offered a window to the past, revealing not only the religious beliefs of the Egyptians, but also details about the daily life, the politics and culture of an era that seemed lost. Carter's discovery was not exempt from controversy. Rumors of a curse that persegued he used those who disturbed the grave circulated throughout the world, fed by the death of some team members in unusual circumstances. Although these stories were discarded as superstitions, they added an even more mystical aura to the finding. Today, the Valley of the Kings remains a place of fascination and amazement. As archaeologists continue to dig up their secrets, the echo of their former residents resonates in each camera and each passage. The tombs, although worn by time, are still witnessing the greatness of the pharaohs and the deep respect that the Egyptians felt for life, death, and eternity. The valley is not only a memory of the past, but a reminder that, even in death, the ancient Egyptians sought immortality. And perhaps, through these tombs and eyes that still contemplate them with astonishment, they have achieved exactly that. Under the golden glow of the Egyptian sun, on the shores of the eternal Nile River, the temples of Luxor and Karnak are raised, imperishable witnesses of a civilization that found in the stone a language to speak with the gods. These temples are not mere structures, they are living sanctuaries where time stops, and each column, each inscription, and every shadow mutter stories of devotion, power, and transcendence. Luxor's temple, with its majestic patio surrounded by columns, seems to emerge from the ground like a lotus flower, a symbol of creation and life. Built mainly under the orders of Amenhotep III and Ramses II, this temple was conceived not only as a place of worship, but as the throbbing heart of the ritual life of Thebes. Every corner of the temple is impregnated with symbolism, from the great pylon that tells the victories of Ramses to the colossal statues that flank the entrance, eternal representations of a pharaoh who sought to be remembered not only as king, but as a living god. A long processional path, bordered by sphinxes with human heads, connects Luxor with Karnak, a physical and spiritual bond that came to life during the Opit party. In this celebration, the statue of Amun-Ra, the main deity of Thebes, was transported in procession from its sanctuary in Karnak to Luxor, symbolizing the renewal. When walking through the Hypostyle Salar, with its 134 columns that rise as petrified trees, one feels the immensity of the cosmos, a scale that dwarfs the human and magnificates the divine. The inscriptions that cover each surface are not simple decorations, they are stories carved in stone. The victories of the pharaohs, the sacred rituals, and the myths that shaped the Egyptian world report. The sacred Karnak lake, an essential element of the complex, was more than a body of water. The Nun represented the original ocean from which creation arose according to the Egyptian worldview. Here, the priests performed purification rituals and reflected in the water the stars of the night sky, thus joining the earthly with the heavenly. But perhaps the most impressive of these temples is not only their physical scale, but their ability to capture the essence of a deeply religious society. Registration in the walls narrate offerings and prayers, but also thorough details of daily life, lists of goods offered to the gods, hymns recorded in stone, and scenes that show the pharaoh interacting with the deities as intermediary between the worlds. Obelisks, those granite needles that challenge the sky, are silent witnesses of Egyptian ambition and spirituality. Carved with inscriptions that glorify the pharaohs and the gods, each obelisk is an eternal message, a cry of devotion that transcends time. Although many of them were transferred to distant lands, those who remain still radiate the energy of the sun to which they were dedicated. Despite the centuries of erosion, looting, and the inevitable weight of time, the temples of Luxor and Karnak remain as monuments to resistance and eternity. When walking between their columns and contemplating their inscriptions, one cannot avoid feeling connected with something bigger, something that transcends the human and touches the divine. These temples are a reminder that, although civilizations can fade, their dreams, carved in stone, can survive to inspire infinite generations. In the depths of southern Egypt, carved in the solid rock of a hill next to the Nilo River, Abu Simbel stands like a testy unwavering mononio of the power and ambition of Ramses II. This complex monumental, with its imposing colossi and its aura of reverence, is much more than a temple. It is a declaration of greatness, an eternal message carved for the gods, men, and eternity. Ramses II, known as the Great, left his mark in the history of Egypt with his government of almost 7 decades. Under his mandate, he not only led military campaigns to expand the empire but also dedicated himself to erect temples that glorify both the gods and their own legacy. Abu Simbel was perhaps the most sublime expression of that vision. There, in a corner section of the Nubio Desert, Ramses ordered to sculpt a temple that dazzled all who will approach, whether they were friends or enemies. The facade of the Great Temple, with its 4 colossal statues of Ramses II, seems to challenge the same idea of time. Each colossus, more than 20 meters high, represents the pharaoh as a living god, sitting on his throne and looking towards the horizon with an almost superhuman serenity. The gigantic proportions and meticulous details of these sculptures reflect not only the mastery of Egyptian artisans, but also the unequivocal message of supremacy that Ramses wanted to convey. These statues were not simple ornaments, they were guardians who protected the temple and affirmed the power of the pharaoh even in the confines of the empire. The interior of the temple, as imposing as its exterior, is decorated with reliefs that narrate the exploits of Ramses II. The Battle of Kadesh, one of the most famous military campaigns in Pharaoh, occupies a prominent place. In these scenes, Ramses appears as an invincible warrior, leading his troops and facing enemies with divine courage. But beyond war, the temple also honors the gods. The interior sanctuary, which only reached sunlight twice a year, housed statues of Amun-Ra, Ra-Harajti, Ptah, and Ramses himself, divinized next to them. This lighting phenomenon, carefully designed, symbolized the heavenly connection between pharaoh and deities. A few meters from the Great Temple is the small temple, dedicated to Queen Nefertari, Ramses's favorite wife. It is a unique work in Egyptian history because it is one of the few temples in which a queen receives a prominence equal to that of the pharaoh. The statues of Nefertari and Ramses, carved together on the facade, reflect not only the love and respect of the pharaoh for its queen, but also the importance of the union between them in the divine and earthly order. However, Abu Simbel's story did not end with Ramses II. In the 20th century, the waters of Lake Nasser, created by the construction of the Assuan Dam, threatened to submerge this treasure under their depths. In a feat that rivals the construction of the temple itself, an international team of engineers, archaeologists, and workers joined forces to save it. Between 1964 and 1968, one of the most ambitious conservation projects in history was carried out. Block to block, the temple was dismantled, transferred to a higher and higher location with millimeter precision. Abu Simbel's transfer was much more than a technical operation, it was an act of love towards human heritage, a promise that the wonders of the past deserve to be protected for the future. Although the temple is no longer in its original location, its majesty is still intact. When contemplating the colossal statues and traveling their corridors, it is impossible not deep of our humanity. At the crossroads between the east and west, where the waters of the Mediterranean caress the coasts of Egypt, Alexandria rose as a lighthouse of civilization and knowledge. Founded by Alexander the Great and enriched under the government of the Ptolemies, this city was not only a political and commercial center, but also a symbol of human potential to achieve greatness through understanding and curiosity. Among its most legendary wonders are two colossi of antiquity, the Lighthouse of Alexandria and the Great Library, monuments that illuminated both the sea and the mind. The Lighthouse of Alexandria, erected on the island of Lighthouse, rose like a majestic tower that guided navigators to the city's safe port. Built under the reign of Ptolemy II Philadelphus in the 3rd century BC, the lighthouse reached an amazing height, estimated between 100 and 130 meters, becoming one of the highest structures in the ancient world. Its design was simple but imposing: a square base, an octagonal central tower and a circular upper section, crowned by a statue that is believed represented Helios, the god of the sun. The light of the lighthouse, generated by a continuous fire and reflected by polished bronze mirrors, was not only an impressive technological advance, but also a symbol of humanity's domain over nature. The lighthouse was more than a guide for sailors, it was a testimony of human ingenuity, a statement that Alexandria was not only a port, but a lighthouse of civilization that radiated light to the world. A few steps from the port, the Great Library of Alexandria extended its influence in a different, but equally crucial area, that of knowledge. Also founded under the mandate of the Ptolemies, the library aspired to gather all the knowledge of humanity. With his endless corridors of scrolls and his atmosphere full of ideas, it was a sanctuary for philosophers, scientists, poets, and scholars around the world. It is said that the library contained hundreds of thousands of texts, compiled with an unprecedented ambition. The ships that arrived at the port of Alexandria were registered, and any manuscript they carried on board was copied. The copy was returned to the owner, while the original was preserved in the library. This practice, although controversial, reflected the determination of Alexandria's rulers to turn their city into the intellectual heart of the ancient world. The scientific and philosophical achievements that emerged from the library are innumerable. It was here that Eratosthenes calculated with remarkable precision the circumference of the Earth, where Herophilo conducted pioneer studies in anatomy, and where Archimedes left his mark on physics and engineering. The library not only housed books, it was a melting pot, a place where the brightest minds gathered to question, learn, and create. However, the story of Alexandria is also a reminder of the fragility of knowledge to adversity. The library, that temple of wisdom, suffered several destruction over the centuries. The flames, looting, and political negligence combined to erase much of their physical legacy. But although the scrolls were lost, the impact of the library lasts. His vision of unifying knowledge and sharing is still an aspiration that transcends time. Today, Alexandria remains a name that evokes astonishment, a bridge between the past and the present. The lighthouse, collapsed centuries ago by earthquakes, lives in legends and in the dreams of reconstruction. The library, although physically missing, symbolically reborn with the inauguration of the modern Library of Alexandria in 2002, a contemporary lighthouse that seeks to honor the spirit of the original. The Lighthouse of Alexandria and the Great Library were not only wonders of its time, but promises of what humanity can achieve when it combines technology, curiosity, and a deep desire to illuminate both the physical and the intellectual world. In their light and in their legacy, both monuments continue to shine, reminding us that knowledge is the lighthouse that guides humanity towards more vast horizons. Throughout history, the vast lands of Nubia and Egypt intertwined in a complex relationship, woven with ties of commerce, war, and a deep cultural influence. Located south of Egypt, during the Middle Kingdom, Egypt consolidated its control over northern Nubia, establishing a network of strengths along the river to protect their interests. These strengths, such as Buhan and Semna, were more than military bastions, they were centers for exchange and cultural contact, where Egyptian soldiers interacted with the clouds, generating a bidirectional flow of customs and traditions. The apogee of military and cultural interaction came during the New Kingdom, when pharaohs such as Thutmose III and Ramses II expanded their influence towards the south, reaching the Fourth Cataract region. Nubia was incorporated into the Egyptian Empire, and its local rulers, known as the Kush princes, were subordinated to the Egyptian administration. At this time, the temples built by the pharaohs in Nubia, such as the spectacular Abu symbol, not only served as religious centers, but also as symbols of domination and propaganda, proclaiming the power of the pharaoh and the supremacy of the Egyptian gods. But Nubia was not a land that was easily subjected. The rich Nubia culture, with its own language, art, and religions, resisted and, in many cases, deeply influenced Egypt. During the Third Intermediate Period, when Egypt faced internal fragmentation, Nubia saw an opportunity to resurface. The Kushitas, descendants of the ancient clouds, advanced north and, under Pi's leadership, managed to conquer Egypt, founding the XXV dynasty, known as the Kushite dynasty. This period marked a fascinating union between the two cultures. The pharaohs Kushitas ruled from Thebes and were shown as defenders of the traditional Egyptian cult, revitalizing the temples and reaffirming the values of the past. At the same time, they left their unique mark, incorporating elements of cloud culture into Egyptian life. The Kushitas' pyramids in Meroe, although smaller and steep than the Egyptians, are witnesses of this cultural fusion, joining two funeral traditions in a single legacy. Mutual influence was not limited to the political or architectural sphere. In art, styles mixed, sculptures and reliefs began to show cloud characteristics, such as more rounded faces and details that reflected life in the south. In religion, the cloudy gods as Apidemak joined the local pantheon, while the Kushitas adopted and adapted Egyptian religious practices, turning their temples into centers of spiritual syncretism. Even in language and music, the interactions left their mark. Nubia's local languages influenced Egyptian dialects, and musical instruments such as harp and lyre moved between the two cultures, creating a sound bridge that resonated along the Nile. Today, the traces of this relationship between Egypt and Nubia remain in archaeological vestiges, in the temples that challenge the time and stories that narrate a link forged in trade, tempered in the war and sealed in the rich cultural mixture of two civilizations that looked through the river and sometimes saw a reflection of themselves. In the vast history of ancient Egypt, the meetings and confrontations with the peoples of Asia marked some of the most decisive chapters. From the invasions of the Hyksos to diplomatic and military contacts with the Levante, these relationships left deep scars and transformed the course of a civilization that, although focused on the Nile Valley, could not ignore the influences and threats of the outside world. The impact of the Hyksos on Egypt was a shake that resonated to the depths of the Egyptian psyche. During the Second Intermediate Period, these Asian invaders, coming from Levante, took advantage of the political fragmentation and internal weakness of Egypt to settle in the Nile Delta. His arrival was not simply a territorial conquest, it was a change in the balance of power that challenged the Egyptian notions of superiority and order. The Hyksos introduced revolutionary technologies, such as war cars, the compound arch and new fortification methods, tools that transformed the way the Egyptians conceived war. The city of Avaris, in the eastern delta, became the capital of the Hyksos, and from there they ruled as a foreign dynasty, adopting elements of Egyptian culture while maintaining their Asian identity. For the Egyptians, this represented a blow not only political, but also ideological. The presence of foreign rulers broke with the belief that the pharaoh was the divine protector of the earth. However, this occupation also sowed the seeds of a fierce response. The princes of Upper Egypt, led by figures such as Seqenen-Retah and then Ahmose I, undertook a prolonged struggle to expel the Hyksos and restore Egyptian control. The final victory over the Hyksos marked the beginning of the New Kingdom, an era of rebirth and expansion. Armed with the lessons learned from their former invaders, the Egyptians adopted the military technologies and used them to project their power beyond their traditional borders. The pharaohs of the New Kingdom, from Ahmose to Ramses II, carried out campaigns in Levante, extending Egyptian domain to Canaan and Syria. These expeditions not only secured the eastern border, but also provided access to strategic trade routes and essential resources such as wood, metals, and exotic products. The Levante, a bridge between Africa, Sia, and Europe, it was a region of great political and economic dynamism. The Egyptians found face-to-face with powerful kingdoms and city-states such as Mitanni, Hatti, and Ugarit, in addition to the always-present nomadic tribes. These interactions were not always hostile. On many occasions, relations with Levante were marked by diplomatic and cultural exchange. Amana's letters, a clay tablet treasure registered in cuneiform writing, offer a fascinating vision of these relationships. In them, the pharaohs corresponded to foreign rulers, exchanging gifts, negotiating marriage alliances, and solving disputes. However, the war was never far away. Military campaigns in Asia reached their culminating point under the reign of Thutmose III, a brilliant strategist that led numerous expeditions in Canaan and Syria. In the Battle of Megiddo, Thutmose demonstrated his tactical genius by defeating a coalition of Canaanite princes and ensuring Egyptian hegemony in the region. The victories of Thutmose established an imperial control model that would be followed by their successors, although never without challenges. The greatest confrontation with Asia came during the reign of Ramses II, in the famous Battle of Kadesh. This conflict, freed against the Hittites, was one of the greatest undocumented of antiquity. Although the battle ended in a tactical draw, Ramses presented it as a glorious victory in his monuments, underlining his role as a protector of Egypt against foreign danger. Eventually, Egypt and the Hittites signed the first known peace treaty, an agreement that reflected both the intensity of their rivalry and its mutual recognition and equal powers. However, conquests and conflicts with Asia also had a cost. Maintaining control over distant territories required significant resources, and the constant wars exhausted the Egyptian economy and army. In addition, the arrival of new villages, such as the peoples of the sea, plunged the region into a period of chaos that marked the decline of Egyptian power in Asia. Despite this, contacts with Asia left a lasting legacy in Egypt. From military techniques to artistic and religious influences, these interactions enriched and transformed Egyptian culture. Although the conflicts were intense and, often, devastating, also opened doors to a broader world, connecting to Egypt with a network of civilizations that expanded their worldview and left an indelible mark on its history. The history of interactions between Egypt, Greece and Rome is a fascinating story of conquests, cultural transformations, and encounters that mold the fate of the ancient world. At this crossing of civilizations, Egypt ceased to be an autonomous kingdom to become a scenario where the Greeks and Romans fought for power, and where cultures mixed, creating a lasting legacy that still resonates in global history. The arrival of Alexander the Great to Egypt in the year 332 BC. It marked a fundamental turn. Acclaimed as a liberator by the Egyptians, who were unhappy with Persian domain, Alejandro not only conquered the land of the Nile, but also strategically integrated into their culture. He was proclaimed pharaoh and recognized as a divine leader according to Egyptian traditions. This act not only consolidated its political control, but also established a governance model that its Greek successors, the Ptolemaic dynasty, would maintain for centuries. Alejandro founded Alexandria, a city that quickly became a lighthouse of culture and knowledge. Under the Ptolemies, Alexandria grew as a cosmopolitan center, attracting scholars, merchants, and artists from all over the Mediterranean world. The Great Library of Alexandria and the museum were symbols of this cultural integration, places where Egyptian, Greek knowledge and other civilizations were intertwined, leaving an indelible imprint on intellectual history. The Ptolemaic dynasty, descendant of Ptolemy I, one of Alejandro's generals, ruled Egypt for almost 3 centuries. Although they were foreigners, the Ptolemies adopted many Egyptian customs, including language and religion, to legitimize their domain. Ptolemaic pharaohs not only represented themselves in the Egyptian artistic style, but also supported traditional temples and participated in religious ceremonies. However, his government also brought tensions, since political and economic power remained mainly in the hands of the Greek elite, creating a division between the rulers and the native population. Among the Ptolemies, a figure stands out as a symbol of this interaction era, Cleopatra VII. Educated, charismatic and strategist, Cleopatra was the last ruler of Egypt before his Red annexation Maat. He had inherited a weakened kingdom by internal conflicts and external pressures, but through personal and political alliances with Roman leaders such as Julio Caesar and Marco Antonio, Cleopatra fought to preserve the independence of their land. Its history is a mixture of intrigue, love and tragedy that encapsulates the complexity of relations between Egypt and Rome. The Roman domain officially began in the year 30 BC, after the defeat of Cleopatra and Marco Antonio in the Battle of Actium. Octavio, later known as Emperor Augustus, made Egypt a Roman province. Under Roman control, Egypt became a key piece in the empire, thanks to its agricultural and strategic geographical position. The Egyptian grain fed Rome, and the Nile control ensured crucial trade routes. However, the Roman administration was more distant and pragmatic than that of the Ptolemies. The Romans saw Egypt as a territory to exploit, and although they respected some religious and cultural traditions, they did not seek to integrate into Egyptian life as the Greeks had done. Even so, mutual influence continued. The Egyptian gods, such as Isis, gained popularity throughout the Roman world, and Egyptian art and architecture left a visible brand in Roman aesthetics. Egypt, under the Roman yoke, did not lose its spirit. The sporadic revolutions and the persistent cultural pride show that, although subjected, the Egyptian heart continued to beating strongly. Throughout the centuries, this constant interaction between Egypt, Greece and Rome created a unique synthesis, a convergence of worlds that extended the limits of culture and policy of antiquity. In the temples that still survive and in the texts that these encounters relate, you can feel the tension and richness of this clash of civilizations. From the foundation of Alexandria to the legacy of Cleopatra and the integration of Egypt into the Roman Empire, these interactions not only mold the fate of Egypt, but also left a lasting footprint in the history of the ancient world. Egypt, bathed by the waters of the Mediterranean, was for centuries a crucial actor in the dynamics of the ancient world. His strategic location and his abundance of resources made him a focal point for trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange with neighboring civilizations. From the vast coasts of Greece to the islands of Cyprus and the city-states, Egypt extended its ties beyond the Nile, weaving a network of connections that enriched both their own civilization and those with which it interacted. Maritime trade was one of Egypt's main interaction routes with the Mediterranean. Through its ports in the Nile Delta, especially in cities such as Konopo and Naucratis, vessels loaded with Egyptian goods ventured into the sea to exchange products with other cultures. The Egyptian ships, with their rectangular candles and their robust bodies, transported gold, linen, papyrus, and the precious wheat that was coveted throughout the Mediterranean world. In return, Egypt imported cedar wood from Lebanon, olive oil and Greece wine, as well as metals and jewels of distant lands. The Phoenicians, navigation teachers, played a key role in these commercial interactions. As intermediaries between Egypt and other Mediterranean territories, the Phoenicians brought Egyptian products to places as distant as Carthage and the coasts of Iberia. This relationship was not purely economic. The Phoenicians adopted cultural and religious elements of Egypt, incorporating their deities and symbolism in their own practices. Diplomacy was also a vital tool in the interaction of Egypt with the Mediterranean. During the New Kingdom, the pharaohs established formal diplomatic relations with powers such as Hittites, Mycenaean, and the Minics. These relationships, often sealed with marriages between royal houses, encouraged a peaceful coexistence and allowed the continuous flow of goods and knowledge. Amarna's letters are a living testimony of this diplomacy, showing how the Egyptian pharaohs negotiated with kings and princes of other nations, not only in terms of commerce, but also of political alliances and conflict resolution. However, the exchange with the Mediterranean world was not limited to the tangible. There was a deep and constant flow of ideas, beliefs, and artistic styles that transformed the participating cultures. In the religious sphere, the connections were particularly notable. Egyptian gods like Isis and Osiris found a prominent place in the religions of the Mediterranean. Isis, in particular, was worshipped throughout the Greco-Roman world, and their temples rose in places as distant as Rome and Pompeii. His cult, with his promises of eternal life and connection with the cycles of nature, deeply resonated in Mediterranean societies. Art and architecture also reflected this cultural exchange. The Egyptian motifs, such as the lotus flower and the solar disk, appeared in Greek ceramics and sculptures, while Egyptian artists began to adopt more naturalistic styles influenced by the Greeks. The architecture of cities such as Alexandria, founded by Alexander the Great, merged Egyptian elements with Hellenistic designs, creating a unique style that symbolized this cultural integration. Alexandria, in particular, was a lighthouse of cultural exchange. Under the Ptolemies, it became a knowledge and learning center, attracting thinkers and scholars throughout the Mediterranean. The Great Library and the museum were places where ideas were collected and shared from all over the known world. Greek mathematicians such as Euclid and astronomers as Eratosthenes worked in this city, influenced by ancient Egyptian knowledge in fields such as astronomy and medicine. Not everything was harmony in these interactions. Political and military ambitions often led to conflicts and confrontations. Powers such as the Hittites, the Mycenaeans and, later, the Romans, saw Egypt not only as a commercial partner, but also as a strategic territory to control. These tensions culminated in the conquest of Egypt by Alexander the Great and, subsequently, by Rome, transforming the country into a key piece of their respective empires. Despite these conquests, Egypt maintained their cultural identity, even while absorbing external influences. The connections with the Mediterranean, although sometimes imposed, enriched their social and cultural fabric, leaving a mark that would last for millennia. From the myths of Osiris spread by Phoenician sailors to the Roman temples dedicated to Isis, the legacy of these interactions resonates on the coast of the Mediterranean and beyond. The history of the latest Egyptian dynasties is a story of vanished glory, of an empire that once rose like the lighthouse of civilization and that, over time, succumbed to internal decline and external threats. In this sunset, Egypt witnessed a heartbreaking change of power, brutal looting and the slow erosion of his sovereignty, while his sacred temples and legendary cities became shadow of what they had been. Towards the end of the Third Intermediate Period, Egypt had already begun to fragment. The centralized authority of the pharaohs crumbled, giving way to local leaders fighting for control. This dispersion of political power left the country vulnerable, not only in the face of its own internal conflicts, but also against foreign invaders. The priests of Amun, with their enormous religious influence, acted almost as independent sovereigns in Thebes, while Barjo Egypt was exposed to foreign influences from the Mediterranean. The late period brought with it an ephemeral resurgence under leaders such as Samnetic I of the XXVI dynasty, who tried to restore the splendor of the past. With strategic alliances and an army reinforced by Greek mercenaries, Psammeticho managed to temporarily unify the country. Under his government, Egypt experienced a cultural revitalization, with the construction of temples and a return to ancient artistic traditions. However, this stability was fragile, and foreign forces were waiting for their opportunity to intervene. The arrival of the Persians under Cambyses too marked a devastating moment for Egypt. In 525 BC, Cambyses defeated the pharaoh Psammeticho III in the Battle of Pelusium, a confrontation that symbolized the vulnerability of an empire worn by internal divisions. The stories describe the brutality with which Cambyses treated Egypt, looting temples, humiliating the elite and desecrating sacred symbols. Although these stories may be influenced by Egyptian propaganda, they reflect the collective humiliation that the country felt. Egypt became a Persian satrapia, administered from afar by foreign governors who saw the country more as a source of resources than as a kingdom worthy of respect. However, the Egyptians never fully accepted this domain. The resistance was constant, with attempts of rebellion led by leaders such as Amyrtius, the last native pharaoh of Egypt, who briefly fought for freeing the country before being defeated again by the Persians. The rise of Alexander the Great in the 4th century BC. He offered Egypt a new opportunity to free himself from the Persian yoke, but this liberation was nothing more than a change of hands. Alexander was received as a liberator, even as a god, and founded the city of Alexandria, who would become a symbol of the cultural mix between Egypt and the Hellenistic world. However, after his death, Egypt became governed by the Ptolemies, a Greek dynasty that, although he adopted many Egyptian customs, ruled with a view set on foreign interests. With the Ptolemies, a painful paradox arrived, an Egypt that was both a center of cultural wealth and an increasingly alienated kingdom of their own roots. While Alexandria shone like a lighthouse of knowledge and commerce, the rest of the country suffered under excessive taxes, social inequalities, and increasing distancing between the rulers and the people. The final blow came with the arrival of the Romans. After the death of Cleopatra VII, the last vestige of pharaonic power was erased, and Egypt became a province of the Roman Empire. Under the domain of Rome, Egypt even lost the illusion of autonomy. His agricultural wealth was exploited to sustain the empire, and his sacred temples, which once resonated to the gods, were silent. The decline of the latest Egyptian dynasties was not a sudden event, but a painful and gradual process that left the country torn between its past glories and the relentless forces of change. Each invasion, each looting, and every loss of power was a reminder of the fragility of even the greatest civilizations. And yet, in the midst of this decline, the resilience of the Egyptian spirit never disappeared completely. finding ways to persist through the centuries, in myths, in monuments, and in the memory of the ancient world. The history of Egypt in the centuries after the fall of its power is a history of resistance, cultural and religious transformation, and titanic struggles for independence. The arrival of the Persians and, later, Greek domination marked a radical change for Egyptian civilization. With these new empires, both oppression and the clash of cultures came, but also the opportunity to reborn in new forms. However, that opportunity came with a high price, the loss of its old sovereignty. The Persian invasion in the 6th century BC, under King Cambyses II, meant a devastating blow to Egypt. In 525 BC, Cambyses defeated the last native pharaoh, Psammeticho III, in the Battle of Pelusium, and after that victory, Egypt became part of the vast Persian Empire. The fall of the last native Egyptian dynasty was not only a military coup, but a blow to the heart of a civilization that had been in history with thousands of years. The Persians, known for their pragmatic control and administration policy, did not completely destroy the Egyptian culture, but imposed their domain in a way that changed the fate of the country. Under the Persians, Egypt became a satrapia, a province of the empire that had to pay taxes and follow the orders of the great king in Persepolis. However, the Persians did not try to erase the Egyptian traditions completely. Instead of imposing a complete cultural restructuring, they allowed the Egyptian priests to continue in the control of their temples and religions, under the condition that they were submitted to the Persian government. Although the Persian administration was generally tolerant with the religious and cultural beliefs of Egypt, it was not enough to win the heart of the population. The Egyptians, who saw the pharaohs as living gods, could not easily accept submission to a foreign monarch. Persian domain unleashed several rebellions, and the desire to restore independence became the fire that burned in the hearts of many Egyptians. Despite the efforts by the Persian rulers to consolidate their control, Egypt remained a fertile terrain for resistance. It was during this time that figures like Amertius, a native leader, rose to challenge Persian power. After a series of revolts and rebellions, Amertius managed to establish a brief period of independence in 404 BC. This little respite for Egypt did not last long, since the Persians returned strongly in 343 BC, and the country fell under its domain, although now weakened by their internal struggles. However, the fate of Egypt was about to take a transcendental turn with the arrival of Alexander the Great in 332 BC. Alejandro, after conquering the Persian Empire, addressed Egypt as part of its expansion. Upon arriving, the Egyptians, fed up with foreign invasions and Persian oppression, received it as a liberator. During his brief stay in Egypt, Alejandro was proclaimed pharaoh, and founded a new city, Alexandria, which quickly became the center of the intellectual and commercial life of the Mediterranean. Despite the welcome, the arrival of the Greeks brought with it an even deeper change for Egypt. Alejandro founded a Hellenistic dynasty, the Ptolemaic dynasty, whose descendants would govern Egypt for 3 ages. The Ptolemaic dynasty marked the beginning of a new era, an era in which Egypt went from being a land governed by pharaohs native to a region under the control of a Greek dynasty, although adapted to Egyptian culture. The Ptolemies adopted many Egyptian customs to win the favor of the people, such as worshipping the Egyptian gods, dressing as pharaohs, and being seen as the legitimate successors of the ancient pharaohs. However, despite this cultural integration, the relationship between the Greeks and the Egyptians was never completely harmonious. Although the Ptolemies ruled in the name of the Egyptian tradition, the native people looked more and more as an undergoing population, and the tensions between the Greek elites and the Egyptian population increased. The classes division, the high tax rates, and the exploitation of natural resources for the benefit of Ptolemies sowed deep resentment. The struggle for independence never ceased. During the centuries of Greek domination, Egypt experienced several surveys, in which the Egyptians tried to recover what they felt that belonged to them by right. However, this fight was largely symbolic. The Ptolemies were able to maintain their power thanks to their military superiority and their connections with the Mediterranean powers, but the spark of resistance was always alive in the minds and hearts of those who dreamed with a free and autonomous Egypt. The struggle for independence, however, found his best-known face in Cleopatra VII, the last of the Ptolemies. Cleopatra, a determined and cunning woman, tried to restore the greatness of Egypt and protect her independence against the growing pressure of Rome. Although he allied with great figures such as Julio Caesar and Marco Antonio, Cleopatra's fight ended in tragedy. After the defeat of his Roman allies in the Battle of Actium, Egypt finally fell under the absolute domain of Rome, becoming a Roman province in 30 BC. Egypt's domain by Persians and Greeks forever transformed the nature of Egyptian civilization. The first Persian invasion, followed by the Hellenistic influence, eroded the old political structures, but also brought with them a new phase of cultural and religious exchanges. The Egyptians saw how their land became before their eyes, losing their independence, but winning a new place in the Hellenistic world and, finally, in the Roman Empire. The struggle for independence never went out at all, but Egypt, in its Hellenistic and Roman version, was never the same as before. Cleopatra VII is a figure that embodies the tragedy of an empire that falls, a symbol of the struggle for independence and power, but also a reflection of the complexes of love and betrayal that marked its reign. The last queen of Egypt, whose name resonated in the halls of Roman power, lived a life marked by its determination, intelligence, and constant struggle to maintain control over its ancient kingdom as Rome approached more and more to its door. Throughout his reign, Cleopatra desperately sought to prevent Egypt from falling under the domain of Rome. From the beginning, their alliances with Rome were not a choice, but a necessity. At the death of his father, Ptolemy XII, Cleopatra mounted to the throne along with his brother Ptolemy XIII, but soon he was caught in a struggle of power with him. The political situation in Egypt was fragile, and Cleopatra, despite being the legitimate heiress, was banished from Alexandria by his brother, who, supported by the council of his court, ruled with a hard hand. However, he did not give up. It was then that his strategy began to recover power, seek the help of Rome. His encounter with Julio Caesar, the most powerful Roman leader of his time, was the first of many movements that would mark his destiny and that of Egypt. They tell the stories that Cleopatra appeared against Caesar wrapped in a carpet, deploying before him as a symbol of his cunning and determination. This bold entrance not only captivated Caesar, but began a relationship that would change the story. After helping Cleopatra recover his throne, Caesar remained in Egypt for a while, and his romance with the Egyptian queen was public and controversial. Cleopatra not only became Caesar's lover, but also an essential political ally for Roman interests in the Eastern Mediterranean. Together, Cleopatra and Caesar had a son, Ptolemy XV Philometor Caesar, known as Caesarion, who was proclaimed king of Egypt. With the help of Caesar, Cleopatra restored his domain, but the power of Rome over Egypt was even more consolidated. In 44 BC, after Caesar's murder in Rome, Cleopatra found himself in front of a new Roman leader, Marco Antonio. As with Caesar, Cleopatra filed a personal and politics with Antonio, seeking the protection of Egypt against the growing influence of Rome. During these years, Cleopatra and Marco Antonio consolidated a joint empire, with Cleopatra as Queen of Egypt and Antonio as the military commander of the East, governing vast regions of the Roman Empire. However, Cleopatra's fate was marked by the intricate power struggles in Rome. The confrontation between Marco Antonio and Octavio, the future Emperor Caesar Augusto, resulted in a civil war that would change the history of the ancient world. The conflict culminated in the famous Actium battle in 31 BC, a naval confrontation in which Antonio and Cleopatra's forces were defeated by the Octavio fleet. The defeat was devastating for the real couple, not only militarily, but also politically. With the fall of his army and his fleet, Cleopatra and Antonio were forced to retire to Egypt, where his final destination was already sealed. The fall of Cleopatra was both political and personal. Octavio, who consolidated himself as the most powerful man in Rome, did not allow the last queen of Egypt to survive his defeat. In 30 BC, after the fall of Alexandria, Cleopatra and Marco Antonio committed suicide, according to the chronicles, being unable to face humiliation and capture by the Roman forces. Cleopatra's death, although tragic, marked the end of an era in Egypt. After his death, Egypt was formally attached as a province of the Roman Empire, and the dream of an independent Egypt vanished forever. The impact of Cleopatra's reign was deep. His bold figure, capable of navigating the stormy seas of Roman and Egyptian politics, represented the last resistance of a millenary civilization in the face of the unstoppable expansion of Rome. In his time, Cleopatra was seen as a leader who was trying to save his people and his culture of the Roman yoke. Her political ability and intelligence, combined with her personal charm, gave her a historical relevance that made her an icon not only in Egypt, but the collective imaginary of the Western world. His reign also marked the end of Egyptian independence, an independence that Egypt had maintained for more than 3,000 years. With the death of Cleopatra, Egypt lost its autonomy and became part of a foreign empire. The land of the pharaohs, which had witnessed the greatest wonders of antiquity, was now under the absolute control of Rome. But Cleopatra, in his fall, left an indelible brand in history. His figure was admired, mitigated, and transformed into a legend for later generations, not only for his beauty and his charism, but for his tireless struggle to keep the greatness of Egypt alive. Cleopatra's relationship with Rome, full of intrigues, passion and political struggle, became one of the greatest stories of love and power in ancient history. The legacy of his reign, therefore, is not only found in the pages of history books, but in the fascination that still awakens in popular imagination. Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, will be remembered not only for its fall, but also by the way it fought until the last breath to defend its kingdom, their people, and its identity. When Egypt fell under the control of the Roman Empire, in 30 BC, the Egyptian civilization, which had flourished for more than 3,000 years, experienced a monumental change. The fall of Cleopatra VII marked the end of the last Egyptian dynasty and the incorporation of Egypt as a Roman province. From that moment on, Egypt not only became a territory dominated by Rome, but began to adapt to the administrative and cultural methods of the Romans, which brought with it a series of deep transformations and, in turn, the foundations for the religious future of the country. From the beginning, the Roman administration established direct control over Egypt. Under the Roman Empire, Egypt was governed by a prefect, a Roman military officer who reported directly to the emperor. Unlike other Roman territories, Egypt was not organized in an autonomous local government province, but was considered a personal possession of the emperor, given its strategic and economic value. This centralized control allowed Rome to extract enormous resources from Egypt, especially in the form of grain, which was essential to feed the masses in the imperial capital, Rome. The Egyptian grain was one of the pillars of the Roman economy, and Egypt, as a barn of the empire, became an even more vital territory for the support of Roman power. The Romans also left their mark on Egyptian culture. Roman influence was noticed in many areas, from architecture to everyday life. In Egyptian cities, such as Alexandria, new pubs were built, Roman-style spoils, and new customs and practices were introduced. Although the Greek language remained common in the upper classes, Latin began to gain relevance in administration and public life. However, Egyptian culture did not disappear completely. The Romans adopted many of the Egyptian religious practices, and some emperors even presented themselves as pharaohs, continuing the tradition of the ancient Egyptian rulers. The veneration of the Egyptian gods remained part of daily life, although now under the supervision of the new rulers. One of the most surprising aspects of the Roman era in Egypt was the rapid Christianization of the region. Although Egypt had been the home of a rich religious tradition, with its pantheon of gods such as Ra, Osiris, and Isis, as Christianity expanded by the Roman Empire, Egypt became an important Christian center. Christianity was introduced in Egypt in the 1st century AD, and the region experienced a gradual conversion during the first centuries of the Roman Empire. Alexandria, who was already a cultural and intellectual center in the Hellenistic world, also became a Christian center of great influence. Christianity spread rapidly in Egypt, but not without opposition. The Christian communities in Egypt often faced persecutions by the Roman emperors, who considered Christianity as a threat to the established order. During the first 3 centuries of Roman domain, Christians were subject to hard persecutions, and many suffered martyrdom. However, as the Roman Empire adopted Christianity, the situation of Christians in Egypt changed dramatically. In the 4th century AD, the Roman Emperor Constantine I, after his conversion to Christianity, legalized religion through the Edict of Milan in 313 AD, ending persecutions. Christianity went from being a persecuted sect to the official religion of the Roman Empire. In Egypt, this meant a radical transformation into the religious structure. Pagan temples were closed and many of the traditional Egyptian religious practices were abandoned or suppressed. Despite this, the influence of Egyptian traditions in Christianity remained alive, especially in the way Christianity developed in Egypt. Egypt became an important center of Christian monastic life. Christian monkachism, which originated in Egypt with figures such as San Antonio el Grande, the father of Monkeyism, had a deep influence on the history of Christianity. The Egyptian monks began to retire to the desert in search of a life closer to God, and the monastic communities multiplied throughout the centuries. Egypt, therefore, was not only a center of persecution and suffering for the early Christians, but also a place where a new religious way of life was born that would have a lasting impact on world Christianity. As Christianity consolidated in Egypt, the country's social and political structure also experienced changes. The Egyptian population, who had been under the yoke of the pharaohs and after the Greeks and the Romans, became a predominantly Christian society. The last vestiges of the ancient Egyptian religions began to fade. The ancient practices, the temples, and the gods were replaced by Christian churches and monasteries, and many of the ancient places of worship, such as the temples of Isis and Osiris, were converted into Christian or abandoned churches completely. With the fall of the Roman Empire of the West in the 5th century AD, and the subsequent invasion of the Arabs in the 7th century, Egypt continued to transform, but no longer under Roman domain. However, the impact of Christianity on Egypt during the Roman period was deep and durable. The Christianization of Egypt, which began during the Roman reign, defined the religious and cultural identity of the country for centuries to come. The Roman Egypt was, therefore, an era of great transformations, in which the administrative and cultural changes imposed by Rome coexisted with the resistance and adaptation of the ancient Egyptian civilization. The Christianization of Egypt, with its emphasis on monastic life and the conversion of ancient temples in iglesias, marked a new chapter in the country's religious history. And although the Roman Egypt ended with the arrival of the Arabs, the legacy of Christianity in Egypt would continue to be a fundamental part of its history for many more centuries. After the fall of Egypt under Roman dominance, the ancient splendor of Egyptian civilization began to fade slowly. For centuries, the country that once had been the epicenter of one of the most advanced and mysterious cultures of Mundu was reduced to a Roman province, then Byzantine, and finally Arabic. Although Egypt did not completely lose its identity during this long period of darkness, much of its history and its most great achievements were forgotten. The knowledge of the pharaohs, the pyramids, and the impressive temples became a shadow of the past. Ancient Egyptian culture was gradually displaced by new influences: Christianity, Islam, and Roman and Byzantine customs. The wisdom of the ancient Egyptians, the mysteries of their religion and the wonders of their architecture, fell into the oblivion of successive generations. The fall in the oblivion of Egypt was not only a gradual process, but also a consequence of the deep political, social, and religious changes that shook the region. In the Middle Ages, Egypt was more perceived as an Arab and Muslim territory, and its pharaonic heritage, although respected, passed to the background. The pyramids of Giza, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, began to be seen by many as simple mountains of stone, and the temples, for the most part, became ruins covered by the sand and time. The great statues of the pharaohs and the monuments of the Egyptian gods were covered with oblivion, while the new population clung to their newly adopted faith and culture. However, despite this long cultural eclipse, ancient Egypt never disappeared completely. The footprints of their great civilizations were still there, latent, hoping to be rediscovered by future generations. And it was precisely in the 18th and 19th centuries when the oblivion began to rise, and the Western world began to look back towards Egypt, amazed by the vestiges of a civilization that seemed to have come out of a dream. The spark that ignited this rediscovery occurred in 1798, when Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Egypt. His army not only sought to conquer the country, but also learn more about its mysteries. During the French occupation, a group of scientists and scholars who accompanied Napoleon began studying the ancient ruins of Egypt. It was then that Rosetta's famous stone was found, a finding that would change the course of the history of ancient Egypt forever. The stone, which contained a text written in 3 languages, a Demotic and hieroglyphic Egyptian, finally allowed to decipher the Egyptian hieroglyphs, the sacred writing that had been lost for more than 1,000 years. The deciphering of the hieroglyphs opened a window to the Egyptian civilization that European scholars had not seen in centuries. The works of Jean-François Champollion, a French scholar, gave way to a new era of exploration and understanding of Egypt. With the ability to read the ancient Egyptian texts, academics could access a wealth of information about the history, religion, and customs of the pharaohs, which previously seemed completely inaccessible. As European expeditions increased in number and sophistication, Egypt began to attract explorers, archaeologists, and adventurers who wanted to unravel their secrets. During the 19th century, the country became a true care center for archaeologists. The obsession with the ancient Egyptian wonders became so great that, in a few years, there were a series of amazing discoveries. Temples, tombs, and pyramids that had been buried under the sand for millennia began to come to light. The Valley of the Kings, where the tombs of the pharaohs lie, was discovered again, revealing the world magnificent burials and funeral treasures that had never been seen. One of the most famous discoveries of this era was, of course, the tomb of Tutankhamun, discovered in 1922 by the British archaeologist Howard Carter. The finding of Tutankhamun's treasures not only fascinated the world, but unleashed a new fever through Egypt, a passion to learn more about the pharaonic past that would not stop. The figure of Egypt began to renew in the collective mind of humanity. It was no longer just a distant and mysterious place, but a testimony of human greatness, a civilization that, despite having disappeared thousands of years ago, was still alive through its monuments, their writings, and its cultural legacy. The fascination with Egypt expanded beyond the academy, becoming a cultural phenomenon. Giza's pyramids, sphinxes, and hieroglyphs began to be symbols of mystery and wisdom in literature, art, and popular culture. Egypt, forgotten for centuries, was rediscovered not only as a past civilization, but also as an inexhaustible source of inspiration. Archaeology in Egypt was consolidated as a scientific discipline in itself, and the discoveries made over the 10th centuries 8 and 19 were only the beginning of a series of revelations that would continue to the present. Egypt, who had been the cradle of one of the brightest civilizations in history, was now receiving renewed attention, not only for its historical value, but also for its ability to continue captivating humanity with its unresolved mysteries. The oblivion of Egypt, who lasted centuries, was followed by a rediscovery that left the world of speech. Of the rubble of an ancient civilization, a new understanding of its history, its achievements, and its greatness arose. In the process, Egypt ceased to be just a memory of past times and became a lighthouse of knowledge and fascination for future generations. The story of Egypt, somehow, never ended. I was just waiting to be rediscovered. And when it finally was, he left an indelible mark on the modern world. It was on July 15, 1799, in the distant Egyptian desert, when a French soldier found something that would forever change the way the world saw the ancient Egyptian civilization. In a close fortress to Rashid, known in the West as Rosetta's stone, covered by the sand for centuries, came to light. This stone, almost 1 meter high and 76 centimeters wide, had registered a message recorded in 3 writings: Greek, Demotic, a simplified form of the Egyptian, and Egyptian hieroglyph. At first glance, it seemed to be a simple piece of stone, but inside it kept a key capable of opening the door to the understanding of the ancient Egyptian texts, which until then had remained sealed in an enigma. For thousands of years, the Egyptian hieroglyphs were a sacred writing, such an intricate and mysterious language that had baffled generations of scholars. Despite his presence in great monuments and ancient temples, the meaning of these symbols, which had been recorded by priests, pharaohs, and artisans, had been lost over time. The ancient Egyptians had disappeared long before the Roman Empire was extinguished, and for centuries, their writing had been completely misunderstood. As the French expedition advanced in its studies on Egypt, Rosetta's stone became a crucial object. French experts realized that the text in Greek, which was readable and understood by many, should have the same meaning as the one that appeared in hieroglyph and demotic. Thus began a career to decipher the mysteries of the hieroglyphs, but it was not until a man, Jean-François Champollion, devoted himself tirelessly to this challenge, that the doors of ancient Egypt opened definitively. Champollion, a young French scholar passionate about languages, was the key man in this deciphering process. Since his childhood, he had shown exceptional talent to learn languages. At 16 he already dominated Greek and Latin, and throughout his life, his interest in Eastern languages led him to study Hebrew, Arabic and, of course, the Egyptian. It was his understanding of the Greek that allowed him to glimpse the key to solving the mystery of the hieroglyphs. In 1822, after years of effort and dedication, Champollion proclaimed their discovery. The hieroglyphs were not only a system of pictographic symbols, as many had supposed, but combined phonetic and ideographic elements, with some symbols representing sounds and others representing concepts. The day Champollion announced his achievement, the academic world was shaken by the magnitude of his discovery. The Stone of Rosetta, together with its tireless work, finally allowed scholars to read and understand the Egyptian texts, from inscriptions on the walls of the tombs to the great chronicles of the pharaohs. What was previously an unwavering mystery could now be understood, and the ancient Egyptians began to speak, at least in part, through their own words recorded in stone. The impact of this achievement was immediate and revolutionary. Not only did he open the doors to a deeper knowledge of the history, culture, and religion of ancient Egypt, but also laid the foundations of Egyptology as a modern scientific discipline. As studies on Egypt multiplied, archaeologists and Egyptologists began to better understand social structures, religious beliefs, the policies and achievements of a civilization that, until then, had been trapped in the fog of time. With the deciphering of the hieroglyphs, the Egyptologists could understand the funeral texts, the religious hymns, the real letters, and the monumental inscriptions. The stories of the pharaohs and stories about the gods and beliefs of the Egyptian people began to decipher. These texts not only revealed details about everyday life in Egypt, but also provided a deeper vision of their world view, how the Egyptians saw the world and its place in it. The stories of gods such as Ra, Osiris, and Isis, the legends of creation and life after death, came alive again. In addition, the deciphering of the hieroglyphs allowed archaeologists to locate and better understand the funeral places of the pharaohs and the temples dedicated to the gods. The inscriptions that adorn the tombs and pyramids began to offer clues about funeral rituals, beliefs about the beyond, and the aspirations of the ruling elite. This contributed to a greater understanding of funeral practices and the mysteries of mummification, which formed an integral part of Egyptian religious and cultural life. The impact of this discovery was not only academic, but also cultural. The fascination with Egypt grew exponentially in the West. During the 19th century, European museums began to acquire a lot of Egyptian artifacts, and trips to Egypt became a fashion among wealthy Europeans. Egyptomania, as it was called, flooded popular culture. Art, architecture, and fashion forms were influenced by archaeological discoveries, and Egypt began to occupy a prominent place in the collective imagination of humanity. In addition, the work of Champollion and the decipherment of the hieroglyphs served as a catalyst for the flowering of Egyptology as a field of study. The archaeological expeditions multiplied, and key figures such as Flinders Petrie and Howard Carter began to make discoveries that further enriched knowledge about ancient Egypt. Carter, in particular, would be known for the discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922, a finding that captivated the world and renewed interest in Egyptian civilization. However, although the deciphering of the hieroglyphs opened a window to Egyptian history and culture, he also raised questions about the looting and destiny of many of the treasures and artifacts that the Egyptians had left behind. While archaeological discoveries brought light to the history of Egypt, a debate on respect and preservation of their heritage was also generated. At present, the Champollion legacy and the deciphering of the hieroglyphs are still alive. Egyptology continues to be a vital scientific discipline, which continues to reveal secrets of ancient Egyptian civilization, although some mysteries are still to be resolved. Undoubtedly, the discovery of the Rosetta Stone and Champollion's work forever changed the way we understand ancient Egypt, and its impact is still felt today, while we continue to decipher the traces of the pharaohs and the gods that once they ruled the lands of the Nile. Modern Egyptology, a discipline that began with the deciphering of hieroglyphs in the 19th century, has traveled a long way from its humble beginnings. Today, Egyptology is one of the most dynamic areas of archaeology, fueled by scientific advances, cutting-edge technology, and a constant search for the past of one of the greatest and most mysterious civilizations in history. As humanity has continued its exploration of the secrets of Egypt, great discoveries have emerged that have shaken the foundations of our understanding about this ancient culture. These discoveries have not only expanded our knowledge of the pharaohs and their reigns, but have also given us a more detailed vision of everyday life, religious beliefs, and customs of the Egyptian people. One of the great milestones in modern Egyptology was the discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922 by the British archaeologist Howard Carter. Although Tutankhamun was not one of the most powerful pharaohs in Egypt, its tomb contained a treasure of funeral artifacts and incalculable value objects. This discovery was a true revolution for Egyptology, not only because of the treasures found, but because archaeologists have a deeper vision of funeral practices and beliefs about life after death. The artifacts of the tomb of Tutankhamun, from its famous funeral mask to its furniture and jewels, revealed impressive details of the wealth and splendor of the pharaonic court. But the impact of this discovery did not stop there. The tomb of Tutankhamun also marked the beginning of a series of excavations and discoveries in the Valley of the Kings, a site that had been used for centuries as a place of burial for the pharaohs of Egypt. Over the years, archaeologists and Egyptologists have discovered several real tombs, some of which contained intact sarcophagi, and others with rich treasures that shed light on religious beliefs and funeral customs of the time. In particular, the tombs of Ramses II and Seti I have given scholars a better understanding of religious iconography and funeral art. Another of the most relevant discoveries of modern Egyptology was the location of Luxor's lost city, known as the Nile Athens. In 2020, a team of Egyptian and American archaeologists announced that they had discovered a city that dates from around 3,400 years ago, during the reign of Amenhotep III, one of the most powerful pharaohs of the 18th dynasty. This finding, considered one of the most important in Egypt in more than a century, provides a unique vision of daily life in ancient Egypt. In the city, housing, tools, kitchen utensils, and other artifacts were found, which allowed archaeologists to better understand how people lived at that time. However, the great discoveries have not only been products of traditional excavations. Modern technology has played a fundamental role in modern Egyptology, transforming the way archaeologists carry out their work. The use of avant-garde technology, such as terrestrial penetration radar and 3D scanners, has allowed scientists to examine archaeological sites without the need to physically dig. This has led to surprising discoveries without damaging the delicate and valuable archaeological remains. An example of this advanced technology is the use of computerized tomography, TC, and magnetic resonance, RM, in mummification. Regarding conservation, advances in the preservation to prevent the paintings and engravings on the walls of the graves from erase with the passage of time, techniques were developed to stabilize the environment within the graves and ensure that construction materials do not deteriorate. In addition, studies on air quality and humidity in these places have helped create innovative solutions to preserve these unique monuments. However, advances in technology and conservation have not been just to protect artifacts. A considerable effort has also been made to protect tombs, pyramids, and other archaeological sites of looting. Throughout history, Egypt has suffered looting and destruction of its heritage, but today, archaeologists work hard with the Egyptian authorities to preserve these sacred places. The creation of museums, such as the Great Egyptian Museum in Cairo, which will house many of the largest treasures found in Egypt, is a key step to ensure that these artifacts are protected and accessible to the entire world, while its conservation is guaranteed. Modern Egyptology has transformed our understanding of Egypt and its people, giving us access to an ancient world that, for centuries, had closed for us. The advances in technology, together with the dedication of archaeologists and Egyptologists, continue to reveal secrets and deepen our knowledge of this millenary civilization. Without a doubt, modern Egyptology remains one of the most exciting branches of archaeology, and its continuous progress promises to continue revealing wonders of the past for coming generations. Egypt has always been a brilliant beacon in the vast ocean of human history, a symbol of power, mystery, and greatness. Over the centuries, Egyptian civilization has captivated people's imagination, becoming an inexhaustible source of inspiration action in art, literature, and cinema. Each stone of the pyramids, each hieroglyph, every myth that survives until today, has left an indelible mark on global culture, lighting the spark of the fascination that never goes out. The image of ancient Egypt, with its imposing monuments, pharaohs in gold and gods in human and animal form, has been embodied in an infinity of works of art. During the Renaissance, European artists, discovering the first Egyptian excavations in the 19th century, felt a deep fascination with the majesty of this civilization. The mixture of the mystical and the real was an irresistible cocktail for the creative mind. Egyptian art, with its distinctive style, full of symmetry and symbolism, inspired painters and sculptors, who began to incorporate Egyptian motifs into their work. The temples and the sphinx, the hieroglyphs and the figures of gods, were intertwined with the European aesthetics, giving rise to a current of Egyptomania, an artistic movement that lasted much of the 19th century and that remained alive through the art history. However, it is in the literature where the ancient Egypt becomes one more character, as a protagonist who remains hidden among the pages of the books. From the travel stories of Herodotus to the poetic evocations of romantic authors, Egypt has been a place of reverie. The writings of authors such as Edgar Allan Poe and Oscar Wilde, who explored the mystery and exoticism of Egypt, contributed to feeding the idea of an enchanted place where time seemed to stop and the secrets of the pharaohs still hoped to be discovered. The novel The Portrait of Dorian Gray by Wilde, for example, is famous for his references to the mystical Egypt, where the passage of time and immortality cross in a disturbing way. But if there was something that really catapulted Egypt in the forefront, books such as The Secret of Joyce Tisley's Sphinx or Wilbur Smith's works have resorted to ancient Egypt to explore their secrets, their treasures, and their enormous cultural legacy. The image of an Egypt full of mummies that expect to be awakened, tombs full of wealth and hieroglyphs that hide terrible curses, continue to feed the collective imagination. The Mummy film, starring Brendan Fraser, is a clear example of how cinema continues to evoke that mixture of adventure, mystery, and terror based on Egyptian legends. The image of a former priest or pharaoh returning from death, resurrected by an ancient spell, captures that fascination with eternal death, the beyond and the consequences of disturbing the sacred tombs. But, even outside horror movies, Hollywood productions, and other international cinematographies continue. Pyramid cinema has also managed to merge history and myth. Films such as Gladiator or Ben-Hur, although not directly focused on Egypt, have also contributed to the idea of a civilization that, in its peak, ruled the known world. The majesty of the pyramids, the temples, the sphinx, and the representations of pharaohs as immortal divinities remain elements that feed not only fiction, but the desire to touch, to feel, to explore what was one of the greatest empires of the story. In popular art, from comics to video games, Egypt remains a symbol of mystery and adventure. The Assassin's Creed Origins character, set in Ptolemaic Egypt, has not only fascinated millions of players, but has also served as an entrance door for education in Egyptian history. These media, which combine history and fiction, offer a vibrant way to connect the public with the past and continue to keep alive that flame of fascination with ancient Egypt. Beyond fiction, the fascination with Egypt continues. Each discovery archaeological, every new unearthed tomb, each deciphered hieroglyph remains a spark that lights the curiosity of millions of people around the world. Egypt is not only a place in the past, but it is a cultural phenomenon that continues to evoke dreams and desires. It is a reflection of our own fascination with the eternal, by the secrets that we cannot achieve, and by a civilization that, despite having disappeared thousands of years ago, remains as relevant in our imagination as always. In an increasingly globalized world, Egypt is still an anchor in time, a place where the borders between reality and fantasy are blurred, and the mystery and beauty of their monuments become metaphors of our own desires and fears. The mystery of Egypt will never stop captivating us, because, in the end, what people really seek are not only their secrets, but the magic that still emanates from their golden sands and the echoes of their gods. Ancient Egypt, with its greatness and wisdom, not only left a legacy of material monuments and wealth, but also offered deeply relevant lessons for the modern world. The Egyptian civilization, which flourished for millennia, was not simply an empire built on hierarchies and wealth, but an example of sustainability, social organization, and the ability to adapt to the challenges of its surroundings. In their daily customs, laws, and practices, we can find principles that remain essential for current life, especially in a world that struggles with problems such as climate change, social equity, and resource management. Sustainability in Egypt began with its relationship with the Nile, the vital heart of civilization. The river not only provided water for agriculture, but also regulated economic, social, and cultural life. The Egyptians understood, long before other civilizations, the importance of proper management of natural resources. The annual flood of the Nile, a predictable phenomenon, provided the fertile mud that nurtured its fields, and the management of cultivation lands became a meticulous system. The peasants worked with the floods of the river, following the cycles of nature, and the whole empire depended on that deep knowledge of the environment. In a time when current technological advances did not exist, the Egyptians already applied sustainable practices in managing their environment so that it would guarantee prosperity for future generations. The balance principle with nature was not limited only to agriculture, but also part of the Egyptian worldview. The Egyptians believed in the need to maintain order, Maat, in all aspects of life. Maat was the principle that ensured the harmony between man, nature, and the gods. This idea of balance can teach us today the importance of living in tune with the planet, respecting the limits of the environment and understanding that our survival is linked to the health of the ecosystem that surrounds us. The Egyptians did not see nature as something that they should dominate, but as something that they should live in harmony, a concept that currently translates into the need for practices such as regenerative agriculture and the protection of natural resources. In addition to its relationship with nature, Egypt leaves us valuable lessons about social and political organization. For centuries, the Egyptian government was an effective centralization model. The figure of the pharaoh, who was considered a god on earth, provided a firm leadership figure, while the priests and specialized officials helped to administer the empire efficiently. The governance system was based on the idea that the pharaoh should guarantee the well-being of all its subjects, maintaining order and justice. This centralized approach allowed Egypt to manage vast territories, control agricultural production, and maintain a powerful army. Efficient administration also extended to human resources management. The Egyptians organized large construction projects, such as pyramids, temples, and real tombs, which required thousands of workers. But instead of depending on slaves, as has often been assumed, the Egyptians organized their workers systematically, making sure they had food, clothing, and tools to perform their tasks. In addition, many of these workers were permanent employees, which gave them economic stability. This labor organization system demonstrates the importance of cooperation, planning, and care of workforce, principles that remain essential in modern society. A crucial aspect of social organization in Egypt was its hierarchical structure, but no less in cluster. Although the power was very concentrated in the figure of the pharaoh and the priests, the Egyptian society was organized in various social classes. Artisans, farmers, and merchants played essential roles, and social mobility, although limited, existed through the system of merits and personal achievements. The scribes, for example, had a very respected status and were considered essential for the functioning of the empire due to their ability to read and write. This underlines one of the deepest lessons in Egypt, the importance of education and knowledge in the formation of a solid society. Another fundamental lesson that Egypt leaves the world today is his vision of life after death. Although today many cultures have different interpretations about the hereafter, the Egyptian vision of the trip to immortality tells us about the importance of spirituality and respect for past generations. The mummification, the funeral rituals, and the care granted to the dead not only reflected the belief in eternal life, but also the desire that future generations will remember and honor the ancestors. In an increasingly volatile and changing world, this connection with the legacy and respect for what it was can inspire us to value our roots and transmit a culture of respect and memory. Over the centuries, Egypt has left a legacy that goes far beyond the walls of the pyramids and temples. The lessons that it offers us in terms of sustainability, social organization, respect for the environment, and the importance of knowledge are fundamental to build a more equitable and conscious society. If we could apply only a fraction of the practices that the ancient Egyptians perfected, perhaps today we would live in a more balanced, fair, and respectful world with the planet and others. The ancient Egypt, with his vision of the world and his focus towards life, death, and everything in the middle, remains an inexhaustible source of wisdom. In their monuments, their rituals, and their history, we can find principles that are not only applicable to the past, but continue to resonate in contemporary society, teaching us how to build a more sustainable future, organized and full of purpose. Egypt, a civilization that flourished for thousands of years, left an incomparable legacy that continues to influence the modern world. Its impact extends beyond its monuments and material wealth. Egypt transformed the way we understand society, religion, science, and political organization. One of the most prominent achievements of Egypt was its monumental architecture, especially the pyramids of Giza. These structures were not only tombs for pharaohs, but they represented the Egyptian belief in immortality and the connection between life and death. The perfection with which they were built, using limited resources and an exemplary social organization, remains an astonishment for the modern world. The pyramids and the Egyptian temples, such as those of Luxor and Karnak, continue to be a symbol of the greatness of this civilization. The Egyptian government system also left an indelible mark. Under the figure of Pharaoh, considered a god on earth, Egypt maintained a social order based on principles of justice and harmony. The pharaoh was not only a political leader, but also religious, which ensured the cohesion of the empire. The Egyptian administration was effective, with a hierarchical structure that was responsible for managing everything, from agricultural resources to construction work, which allowed lasting stability in a vast and challenging territory. The Egyptian religion, rich in myths and beliefs about the beyond, also marked the history of humanity. The figure of Osiris, Isis, and Ra, among others, not only were part of the religious worldview of Egypt, but also deeply influenced beliefs in other civilizations throughout history. Funeral rituals and mummification were a sign of respect for life after death and connection with ancestors, a principle that resonated throughout human history. In addition, Egypt was a pioneer in the field of science and medicine. His knowledge about astronomy, mathematics, and anatomy made significant advances that were essential for the construction of their monuments and the improvement of the quality of life. The ancient Egyptians made discoveries in medicine that, in many cases, advanced centuries in their time. The cultural legacy of Egypt extended through the influences he left in the subsequent civilizations, from the Greeks to the Romans, through the influence he had on the European Renaissance. The artistic achievements of Egypt, especially its paintings, sculpture, and hieroglyphs, continue to fascinate us, revealing their ability to represent the divine and the human with a deep symbolism. Egypt, through his wisdom in administration, construction, religion, and science, not only left an empire that lasted thousands of years, but also a legacy that is still alive in the history of mankind. Although Egyptian civilization disappeared more than 2,000 years ago, its impact on culture, art, religion, and science remains a source of inspiration, a reminder of the greatness of a civilization that understood the importance of harmony between the man, nature, and the divine. The mystery of Egypt never fades. Throughout the centuries, this ancient civilization has maintained an almost mystical presence in the collective memory of humanity. Each pyramid, every hieroglyph, every sphinx that remains stands seems to whisper to us secrets of the past, as if Egypt had never stopped talking to us. In spite of the centuries of oblivion, invasions, and changes, its impact is still alive, resonating in our culture, in our art, and in our collective imaginary. Egypt left us more than great monuments, he gave us a vision of the world, a way of thinking that has been passed from generation to generation, even without realizing it. The idea that life has a divine purpose, that death is just a transition and that order must prevail over chaos, are lessons that we continue sharing today, although perhaps we are no longer aware of its origin. Egyptian spirituality, their myths, their gods, and their funeral rituals continue to nurture our curiosity and our beliefs. Through the passage of time, the pharaohs have ceased to be divine figures, but their legacy remains immense. In art, literature, architecture, and more recently in modern Egyptology, Egypt remains an inexhaustible source of inspiration. Its history, with all its splendor and its tragedies, reminds us that the human being has the ability to create something eternal, something that transcends physical death. In its architecture, Egypt taught us to fight for eternity, to build for the future, and in their religion, offered us comfort and hope about what is coming later. But there is something even deeper that makes Egypt go out, and it is the mysterious fascination it generates in all of us. When we look at the pyramids, we not only see stone and mud, but the reflection of human obsession for understanding infinity, to build for posterity, to leave a legacy that survives the transience of life. The ancient Egypt embodies the idea that the truly great is not only built with the hands, but with the soul. Each archaeological discovery, each deciphered hieroglyph, is just a small piece of an endless puzzle. Egypt does not stop inviting us to discover more, to deepen their secrets and question what we know about human history. Its mystery will never die because it is part of the very essence of what it means to be human, the need to understand, explore, learn, and find our own immortality in a world that always changes. It is in that search, in that constant desire to understand what is gone, where Egypt remains alive. It is not a lost civilization, it is a civilization that continues to teach us, which remains part of us, as a seed that continues to germinate in the fertile field of our collective memory. Because although the pharaohs have gone, and their great temples have covered themselves with dust, Egypt is still eternal, and its mystery never dies.